And climate and energy is emerging as a very important component of the EU-India strategic partnership. I'm going to do something a bit cheeky, and instead of going through a bit of a background on EU-India, let me just walk you through some of the titles of my publications over the last 15 years. I'm not really old, I just started very young. But I will just give you a snapshot of the publication titles so you'll see how it's progressed. So beginning with India and the EU, non-identical twins. The EU and India, a loveless arranged marriage. Understanding India. EU-India getting the bilateral compact right. Summit on the threshold of change, breaking the stalemate. Is the EU-India strategic partnership really strategic? EU-India free trade make or break, building a sustainable EU-India partnership, the EU-India strategic partnership from blind acknowledgement towards recognition, a decade of strategic relations, Modi and the EU-India strategic partnership needs a new impulse, but then it gets better. Towards a new India partnership on urbanization, charting a sustainable future, EU-India platforms on energy and climate and urban development, and a bit cheesier, EU-India reincarnation of a strategic partnership, EU-India relations come full circle and redefining a strategic partnership. So it's really come full circle. The EU-India strategic partnership today, I think is one of the most developed of the EU strategic partnerships, and more importantly, it's quite functional. So you have important pillars like climate and energy cooperation, urban development, but also as you see recently, it's a partnership based on solidarity as well. But also on budding foreign policy cooperation. But today, let's look in depth at the climate and energy side of the relationship. So without further ado, let me hand over to Ambassador Santosh Jha. So the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Gauri. These are difficult times, both in India and Europe. And I was just on the phone line a little while ago trying to arrange things to go from Europe to India. But let me, at the very outset, let me thank the Brussels Schools of Governance for inviting me to be part of today's event. I must also extend my greetings to the many distinguished panelists, experts, and participants, many of whom I know in my past incarnations. We are meeting immediately before the historic Porto summit between India and EU. And at this time, people generally ask me about what's going to happen there. And one of the reasons I don't appear in webinars like these is that because we would like that announcements to happen at the right time, at the right place. The significance of the India-EU partnership cannot be emphasized enough. Today's event, focusing on climate action as theme, is very relevant to the India-EU relationship. It's a priority for the leadership on both sides. Since the beginning of my tenure here as ambassador, which began in July last year, it has been my endeavor to emphasize in my interactions with all European counterparts about India's actions on climate in recent years. I have found that much of the Indian accomplishment in recent years in this area had not registered in the EU circles. That India played a critical role in ensuring the successful conclusion of the Paris Agreement in 2015, that at the heart of India's climate efforts is the personal commitment of our Prime Minister, that India has made impressive progress, that there are no fundamental dissonance between India and the EU on the need for climate action. Our carbon footprint is much smaller, and we have amongst the lowest per capita emissions. Our contributions to historical emissions are also very, very low. Despite this, we have committed to making our contribution, recognizing that this is a global problem requiring everyone to make efforts. Even before Prime Minister traveled to Paris in 2015, he had raised the bar for India's climate ambitions. Let me illustrate all this with a few points. In 2014, India increased its renewable energy target to 175 gigawatt by 2022. Recently, we have revised this target upwards based on our progress in the recent years. We have also set additional targets for installing 450 gigawatt of renewable energy by 2030. By this year, India is committed to reaching 40% of installed electricity capacity from non-fossil fuel sources. This was also part of the ambitious targets that India undertook under the Paris Agreement. Then many in India thought that these were unachievable. Now, our Prime Minister has affirmed that we are not only on track to fulfilling them, but we will exceed everybody's expectations in 2030. In fact, we are the only G20 country whose current efforts are regarded as 2-degree Celsius compatible. International reports too have rated India as top of the class and a global leader in renewable energy. Many have commended India on benchmarks such as tackling greenhouse gas emissions, climate policy, energy use, and renewables. We have taken bold steps on afforestation and biodiversity as well. We have committed to restoring 26 million hectares of degraded land by 2030. The area under forest and tree cover in India have gone up by over 16,000 square kilometers in the last 5 years. To put that figure in context, it is equivalent to more than half the territory of Belgium. When the ongoing program is completed, India would have planted 1.25 billion additional trees. Emphasis on climate, green, and sustainability policies have remained the underpinning principle of all our flagship development initiatives. These include programs such as cleaning up our rivers or cities, or the Jal Jeevan mission aimed at universalizing drinking access to water, and linking this to conservation and efficient, sustainable use of water resources. By this year end, India aims to abolish single-use plastics. Our country has also taken the world's largest program of switching to energy-saving LED bulbs. This has reduced carbon dioxide emissions substantially. So these are some of the examples. I'm aware that you will be discussing today many of the critical questions that will confront us at the upcoming Glasgow COP26 conference, including on new targets, on carbon neutrality, etc. We need to ask ourselves if the criteria and methodology of the developed world are equally applicable to the developing world or not. And if so, to what extent? India has excelled in achieving its targets because of its policy and business ecosystem that it has fostered. This is conducive for growth of green economy and green energy. Do we really need a one solution suits all approach of the COP26, or let those persist with their own strategies, particularly if they have been successful in their own countries, and instead look at encouraging them through the provision of finance and technology to support their strong commitments? Let me add also that the domestic emphasis that we have seen in India have mirrored in our international efforts. We have encouraged global initiatives like the International Solar Alliance and the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. We are happy that the EU is going to be a part of the CDRI and is already participating in the ISA. In the EU, we find a mutual partner for making the shift to renewables. As a responsible developing country, conscious of its climate commitments, India welcomes EU's expertise on matters of green financing and clean technology. This can enable us to achieve more than the impressive targets we have set for ourselves. Our partnership on climate change has the potential to be a game changer and a win-win, not just for us, but for the world. I hope to see that the Porto Summit outcomes would talk about practical cooperation rather than being heavy on a normative model which may or may not be applicable to India. I'm looking forward to discussion today, and thank you once again for the opportunity. And all the best to all the participants. Have a good discussion and a good outcome. Thank you.
Ambassador, thank you so much for taking the time to come out, especially in the preparations of the summit. We're very grateful, and especially everything that's going on with India at the moment. So thank you very much, and hope to count on your presence in future events as well that we do. But look forward to a very good discussion today. So thank you again. I will move on to a video recording that we got from the EU ambassador to India So let me directly play that. If I get this correct.
Thank you for inviting me to speak today about climate action at your institute. It is a very topical issue, crucial for the very future of our planet. I'm speaking from Delhi, from India, and as you know, India is now facing the brunt of the global COVID storm, as Europe did until recently, and before that elsewhere. We are now, as the European Union, focusing on to see how best we can help, as India did help in the past few months in providing vaccines to the rest of the world. Our work on climate change and against biodiversity loss is also continuing, as 2021 can be a defining year. We need to make a success of the upcoming COP26 in Glasgow and COP15 in Kunming. We need to take all the necessary steps, the necessary bold steps to keep the temperature increase below 1.5 Celsius degrees and to deliver on the Paris objectives. As the president of the European Commission, von der Leyen, phrased it, after the COVID pandemic, we need to make investments to address the fallback of COVID, investments on an unprecedented scale. But it's not just about rebuilding, it's about building back better. We need to reshape, to build better our economic models towards climate neutral, green, digital, and resilient societies. The policies we put in place now should set our infrastructure, our agriculture, industry in the right path towards greener solutions. And we believe in the European Union that must be no trade-off between growth and the environment. We do consider sustainability-driven investments to be the lasting source of growth and jobs. While investments into high emission industries and environmentally harmful activities will just lead to more environmental degradation and higher costs. So this EU recovery package, Next Generation EU, is underpinned by this new paradigm, by the Green Deal. Our new growth strategy is centered on overcoming the challenges of climate change and environmental degradation. We want to transform the European Union into a resource-efficient, modern, and competitive economy. The European Green Deal provides a roadmap to achieve these objectives, to move to a climate-neutral continent by 2050, with a clean, circular economy, where biodiversity is protected. Energy transition is a key part of this plan. In the European Union, energy production and energy consumption together are responsible for 75% of greenhouse gas emissions. So we need to transform energy production and consumption patterns. We need to change the way our energy systems are shaped. We need to better integrate renewable energy into our grids, and we need to ensure stability of our energy systems in this new reality. And let's not forget in the process the real economic benefits such a transition could bring. It's a major opportunity for a green industrial revolution, which is something which is already starting to happen in the European Union. But if we want to achieve the Paris objectives, the international community needs to act cohesively and consistently. We need all to come together. And the European Union and India can play an important, a key role in shaping this global entity. At the EU-India summit in July 2020 last year, our leaders reaffirmed their commitment to the implementation of the Paris Agreement. And they expressed intention to further enhance cooperation under the EU-India Clean Energy and Climate Partnership, as well as the other cooperative partnerships that we have set up with India to foster our objectives when it comes to sustainable development and environmental protection, such as the Water Partnership or the Smart and Sustainable Urbanization Partnership. And last year, we also signed, very importantly, a joint declaration on resource efficiency and circular economy. In our EU-India cooperation on climate action, we are focusing on the clean energy transition. Both India and the European Union have set very, very ambitious targets for renewables. We both want to become less dependent on fossil fuels. Under the EU-India Clean Energy and Climate Partnership, we do exchange information and best practices on how we want to achieve these ambitious targets, including in the area of offshore wind, solar energy, integration of renewable energy in our grids, and the required storage facilities and technologies. We work together on energy efficiency in the building sector, in devising cooling and cold chains. And very importantly, we are also looking at the required sustainable financing for this energy transition. In our work, we must not just focus on mitigation. No, we also need to address adaptation. It's also crucial. India is vulnerable to the impact of climate change, and so is Europe. So we do not look at climate change in isolation, but we also have to consider the phenomenon and its consequences holistically, via the loss of biodiversity, for instance. It is also part of the problem we need to address. We need to reduce water and air pollution, and we have to create a resilient and resource-efficient economy and society. The European Union and India are already cooperating also within a number of international platforms. And let me mention here this International Solar Alliance, which was launched by India and France in 2015 in Paris. But also the International Platform on Sustainable Finance, which was created to mobilize private capital towards environmentally sustainable investment. And India has also launched the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, which aims at ensuring that the infrastructure is more resilient to climate change globally. And I'm glad to say that in March this year, the European Union became a member of the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. So in short, India and the European Union are cooperating in many areas essential for great growth. And the meeting between the 27 EU leaders and Prime Minister Modi in the coming days, I'm sure it will further strengthen this collaboration. So we are living through difficult times, and this pandemic has made us realize more than ever that global challenges can only be addressed together by the international community in a spirit of solidarity. And science tells us that for climate change, we need to act now for the sake of present and future generations. The pandemic should not result in less ambition in this respect. And in Europe, it has in fact mobilized an even higher level of ambition. We have increased our climate target for 2030 from 40% to 55% reduction. in order to achieve a climate neutral Europe by 2050. Europe and India have different starting points, but we can lead together in this global endeavor. The cost of action in the area of climate change, resource efficiency, biodiversity protection, clean water and clean air, the cost of action is much smaller than the cost of inaction. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we've heard from the EU ambassador to India, Ambassador Ugo Astuto. We're really grateful to them for having taken the time to contribute such an informative speech. Let's go to our first panel directly. So as we've heard from both the ambassadors, the EU and India, both are quite important players in terms of being signatories of the Paris Climate Agreement, and they both have an impressive track record in multilateral climate diplomacy. The EU, as we know, as we heard right now as well, has its own 2050, but also 2030 targets. What really spurred us to have this event and this discussion between both sides was a Bloomberg article recently published, which said that India is considering having a net zero target by 2047, so even before the EU. But what really needs to be understood is what are India's challenges, what are its achievements, and there are quite a few, and where can both partners meet in between. So let's go directly to first understand what the EU and India are doing individually on the global scene, domestically, but also what are their understandings of net zero. So I will call on my first speaker, Mr. Marc Vanheukelen, who's the EU Ambassador at Large for Climate Diplomacy. He was also EU ambassador to the World Trade Organization, has a lot of experience in trade, EU and sustainable development, economic partnership agreements, and has also been the head of cabinet to the former Belgian Minister for Foreign Affairs. And as his counterpart, I would like to invite Dr. Arunabha Ghosh. Dr. Ghosh, thank you very much for being here. I understand you're here despite extreme personal circumstances, so we're doubly grateful to you for being here. Dr. Ghosh is a public policy professional, advisor, author, columnist, and institution builder. He's the founder and CEO of the Council on Energy, Environment, and Water, CEW. And you should check CEW out. They do really great work. We have another of the researcher later in the second session. Dr. Ghosh is leading Asian policy, one of the leading Asia's policy research institutions. He's also the co-chair of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Clean Air and is member of the International High-Level Panel on Environment of Peace Initiative. So, Ambassador Vanheukelen, I pass the floor to you, and then to Dr. Ghosh.
Very good. Thank you, Gauri, and thanks to the organizers for inviting me to take part in this panel. What I will do is say a few words on our climate diplomacy in general, and then home in on our cooperation with India in the field of climate and energy. What is climate diplomacy about? What is EU climate diplomacy about more particularly? I think you can say that climate diplomacy tries to serve four purposes. The first is to persuade third countries to raise their climate ambition and to deliver on it. We in the EU are responsible for 8% of global emissions, and that share is declining further. So we're not going to save the world on our own. And in addition, if we want our public opinion to follow through and take on the challenges associated with emission reductions, then it's important to demonstrate that the rest of the world is also putting its shoulders to the wheel. The second goal of climate diplomacy is to explain and, if necessary, defend the measures we are taking in pursuit of reaching our own targets. On the 14th of July of this year, the European Commission is going to come out with 13 legislative proposals to achieve our new target for 2030, which is minus 55% compared to 1990. We had a target of minus 40%. We have upgraded that to minus 55%. That's not going to be small beer to achieve. We are going to propose measures, the 13 that I've just referred to, and there will be a number of issues that obviously will also have an impact on third countries. The third goal is to contribute to the development of the multilateral framework, notably the rules to implement the Paris Agreement, and more generally, all the decisions taken under the UNFCCC. And finally, there is the work to be done on the nexus between climate and security. Climate and security has two angles. The first is the security issues arising from the damage, the physical damage that climate change is causing, the environmental degradation and the migration flows that it may give rise to, and we have to prepare for that. And then there is the broad question of the geopolitics of the energy transition. When we move to a low energy world, a number of players, especially those that are heavily dependent on fossil fuels for their exports and their public revenue, will have to go through a serious adjustment, and we'll have to help them in that and adjust for that. As to the tools of climate diplomacy, I mean, obviously there is the traditional tool of outreach that I'm daily engaged in, and then the deployment of our incentives. Our development aid will now be geared for more than 30% to climate. The EU budget on development aid for the next 7 years will earmark 30% for climate expenditures. On top of that, you have the development assistance from our member states. But also, of course, the incentives through the more strict rules we will introduce with regard to access to the European market, rules that will be WTO compatible, but that will show the world that that is the path we want to take. And if they want to keep on exporting to us, they will have to follow those same rules. Those things will be quite reflected in the carbon border adjustment mechanism, as well as in the Renewable Energy Directive. Now, this diplomatic toolkit has been used with many partner countries, and including India. Stepping up cooperation with India in the field of climate and energy has obviously been the subject of a lot of reflection and suggestions in the run-up to the summit of this weekend. Moreover, of course, it is also an objective. There's also an objective imperative to do so, because as we all know, the world as a whole is not yet on a pathway that is compatible with the Paris Agreement goals, and both the EU and India are large emitters. Climate was already identified as a topic for collaboration in the summit of 2016, and more specifically through the Clean Energy and Climate Partnership. On the other hand, with regard to climate change, the discussions and dialogues have taken off fairly slowly. And as a matter of fact, the high-level dialogue on climate change took place as late as last week. But on clean energy, there has been for quite some time now a useful dialogue conducted by the EU-India Energy panel. Now, let me distinguish between our bilateral cooperation and then the cooperation to advance the international climate agenda. I mean, on bilateral cooperation, it's clear that the challenges we both face in order to reach our targets have clearly heightened our appetite to work together on a number of very concrete domains of innovation and the rollout of green technologies, and Ambassador Astuto already referred to them. Renewable energy, notably offshore wind and green hydrogen, energy efficiency, for example, in the field of cooling, electric storage technology, and grid modernization. In many developing countries, also in India, a faster transition to a low carbon economy is contingent on two important elements. One is regulatory reform and de-risking of capital investment. And on both issues, I think India and the EU should have a deepened conversation. As to the supply of capital, the European Investment Bank and several of the development banks of the EU member states are already very active in India, and those banks have signaled over the last few weeks their interest in stepping up their green portfolio of finance in India. There are also a lot of things that we can discuss concerning the necessary regional and labor market accompanying measures for the low energy transition. Without measures ensuring what is often called a just transition, it's going to be, for example, very hard to organize the exit from coal, which will be a must over time. If you don't have the just transition, the exit from coal is very hard to sell politically. And then there is the cooperation on the multilateral side. There's much scope for India and the EU to collaborate on that agenda, and that agenda will, of course, figure prominently in this year's top political gatherings, be it at UNGA in September, the G20 at the end of October, and then, of course, in Glasgow early November, the COP26. India, as well as the EU, have shown leadership in setting their emission targets for 2030, and we should exhort together large emitters to do the same. Because even after the Earth Summit of President Biden, there is still a gap of many billions of CO2 equivalent, a gap that has to be closed to stay within or to keep the 1.5 degrees Celsius target within reach. The Carbon Action Tracker has published yesterday a note that says that on the basis of the commitments or the announcement that has now been made, the world will in all likelihood be on track to a 2.5 degrees Celsius warming at the end of the century. There's still, therefore, quite a bit of gap to be closed to get to 2 degrees, let alone the 1.5 degrees Celsius. We are probably going to have something like 45 billion CO2 tons equivalent in 2030 on the basis of the current announcement. If you really look strictly at the 1.5 degrees Celsius, we shouldn't be at 45, we should be at 25. The EU and India have taken various international initiatives to help bring the low carbon economy closer. India is the co-founder and the host of the International Solar Alliance, and India and the EU are members of the International Platform for Sustainable Finance, the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure that Ugo Astuto has referred to, and of the research program Mission Innovation. The various points I've just raised with regard to our bilateral cooperation and on our roles in the international or multilateral context will, I trust, be well reflected in the summit statement that is under preparation for Saturday. Let me conclude by saying that climate is a copybook example of a global common good. It belongs to and is responsibility of everyone, but that has the intrinsic characteristic of entailing the grave risk that too little is undertaken. To preserve that common good, countries have to step forward and exert leadership. I'm hopeful that India and the EU will continue to do so. Back to you, Gauri.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm just going to hand it directly to Dr. Ghosh. What has been India's role on bilateral and multilateral climate cooperation and diplomacy? Would be very interesting to know from your perspective. And thank you, Ambassador Vanheukelen. We really appreciated it. Just to remind everyone, if I may, everyone has just 5 minutes. Keep your remarks short. We'll come back to you in the discussions, but after every speaker speaks, I would encourage all our panelists to ask questions from each other to really have a good debate before we open up to the public. So thanks, Dr. Ghosh, please.
Thank you, Gauri, and thank you to the Brussels School of Governance for inviting me. Many thanks to Ambassador Jha and Ambassador Ugo Astuto, and of course, thanks to Ambassador Vanheukelen for his remarks. Let me get straight to the point in the limited time I have here. When I look at India's multilateral or bilateral climate diplomacy, I see 3 sources of what I call India's soft power in climate change. The first source is the power of resistance, where India and other developing countries has historically, not just with climate negotiations, but with environmental negotiations all the way going back to the early 1970s, resisted against injustices associated with whether it is climate action or whether it is action in other environmental domains, where historical polluters or have not assumed as much responsibility as they should have. And it is that approach that has been driven not just in a resistance to deal making, but even when India has been very critically involved in ensuring that the deals come through. And that is where the example that Ambassador Jha gave of the Paris Agreement becomes extremely important. India introducing the phrase of climate justice into the preambular statements of the agreement, as well as the way India introduced the issue of differentiation the following year in the Kigali Amendment to the Montreal Protocol for the phase down of HFCs. But the power of resistance rests actually on the second power that I call the power of example. And that draws on where India's domestic policies and actions set a direction of travel, which I would say is characterized by 2 things, speed and scale. 10 years ago, we had less than 20 megawatts of solar. Today, we now have 94,000 megawatts of solar and wind, on track with large hydro included to about 140,000 megawatts of renewables, with an ambition for 450,000 megawatts of renewables by 2030. The same can be seen in LED light bulbs, reducing the prices of LED light bulbs from over 300 rupees to nearly 50 rupees within a span of 3 years, in subsidy reform, in increasing access to cooking fuel from just over 50% of the population to more than 80% of the households within a span of 5 years, and so forth. So it's this power of resistance and power of example that then fold into the real issue that I want to talk about today, which is where the bilateral and the multilateral dimension comes in. And I call it the power of leadership. And it's important to understand where the framing of this comes from. And Ambassador Jha asked us a couple of times in his opening remarks, that is the framing that is developed in developed countries the same framing that applies to developing countries? And I would say, in some ways, yes, because the direction of travel is necessary. And my colleague later will talk about India's net zero prospects based on the analysis that he has done. But I think a different framing is also needed. And that is, how do we demonstrate leadership where we bring climate action and enhanced ambition and the need for technology and finance, and the need to accelerate things in a manner that brings the energy transition closer to people. And if you actually go through the different multilateral initiatives, you will see it is that aspect that distinguishes India's approach towards multilateral and bilateral climate diplomacy slightly differently from one that is only framed in carbon terms towards one that is framed increasingly in terms of jobs, growth, and sustainability. Let us consider three such examples. And they've all come up, well, two of them have come up in the comments made so far. So let me just dive into them a little bit. First, the International Solar Alliance. It was, as the speakers before me have noted, announced on the first day of the Paris climate meetings in 2015. And by 2017, with more than 15 member countries signing and ratifying the framework agreement, it became a treaty-based organization. It now has 94 countries that have signed the framework agreement, 75 have ratified it, and including the UK, there are 5 European countries involved. But what is special about this? And why is it, at least I believe, having been very intimately involved in the design of the International Solar Alliance, a different kind of organization, or at least meant to be? Because it brings that energy transition closer to the countries that are yet, some are who are even yet to begin that energy transition. Look at the work programs. Scaling solar applications in agriculture. How do we aggregate demand to bring down the prices of things like solar pumps that could be deployed not just in India and South Asia, but also in the 36 countries of the ISA coming from Africa? Affordable finance at scale, something that Ambassador Vanheukelen mentioned. But what is affordable finance at scale? India alone needs $200 billion of investments for its future renewable energy targets. It's averaging about $18, $19 billion a year. We need $40 billion per year. And if you add up the other developing countries, you need a lot more. But that capital, even if available, is coming at very high costs of interest, which is why the ISA's program around solar risk mitigation initiative becomes important to de-risk and reduce the costs. Scaling rooftop solar or scaling solar mini grids, or looking at distributed e-mobility and energy storage. These are all examples of ISA programs that are not just about writing reports or creating one more international bureaucracy, but about looking at, in a detailed way, what are the kinds of real challenges that you face on the ground in developing and emerging economies. And if India and the EU can cooperate on that front of solving those on-ground problems, there's a lot we can do. A couple of minutes and then I'll close. We've heard about the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. Again, it was announced a couple of years ago, and now as of March this year, 22 member countries, again, including the UK, 5 European countries, plus, as Ambassador Santosh said, there's the European Union also involved. But again, what does a Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure really mean? 75% of India's districts are now hotspots for extreme climate events. We are spending billions, tens of billions of dollars of our own money, and I know Professor Garg can attest to this given the research he has done, in dealing with climate resilience and adaptation. So when countries like India and the developing world put in new power infrastructure, build new railways or airports, think about the fiscal challenges of a climate risk, similar to what the fiscal challenges of a pandemic has faced us with, then a coalition again becomes something much more than just the dialogue and looking at the insurance mechanisms, the safety net cushions that the most vulnerable communities need. And that brings us to the third dimension where I would say India has taken a lead, and again, in partnership with European countries, the LEAD IT initiative, the Leadership Group for Industry Transition, which is co-chaired by India and Sweden, but again has about 15 member countries, 10 of them again including the UK from Europe, and 16 industry partners. And critical areas of intervention, steel, cement, and so forth, the heavy industries. So I've been advising the India-EU clean energy and climate partnership for a couple of years. And when I look at the EU's initiatives and that very neatly framed dimension that Ambassador Vanheukelen mentioned, and I look at India's position on trying to bring the energy transition closer to people, I see basically we need to not just cooperate, we need to ramp up the cooperation on finance, on technology, and on resilience. And if we tested any initiative that India promotes or EU promotes or both promote together through that filter, is it lowering cost of finance or increasing amount of finance? Is it ramping up the technological collaboration, such as on green hydrogen? And is it making our economies and our infrastructure more resilient? Then it's not just continent-sized regions like India and the EU that benefit, but a large swathe of the developing and emerging world that can benefit from that cooperation. Thank you again for your attention and for calling me here.
Thank you, Arnaba. Very pertinent points, and as you mentioned, Dr. Garg as well, who's our next speaker, but also we're very happy to have Goche, if I pronounce it correctly, Dr. Goche Mete, who is head of the Secretariat of the Lead It initiative. But first to Dr. Garg, who's sorry, who's at the Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad. He's also a lead author of many of the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, reports. He's written extensively, 12 books, if I'm correct. That's quite impressive, numerous reports. But he's also worked on UNEP, and so on. So you have a lot of experience on domestic issues as well, on climate change, what India has been doing currently. Dr. Ghosh has mentioned quite a bit internationally, but what can we go in depth on what India has really achieved? What are its challenges? Especially working alongside on poverty alleviation. Other speakers have mentioned just transition and transition from coal. And then to Goche, you will be speaking a lot also about a Lead It initiative. We work on industrial decarbonization quite a bit, and they're called hard to abate sectors because it's not easy. What, in my opinion, will be needed, especially for industrial transition globally, would be a lot of technology transfer as well. And Europe is leading in terms of the breakthrough technologies, low carbon technologies. So let's have a deeper dive into this. Dr. Garg, up to you.
Yeah, thank you, Gauri. Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Yes, thank you. So it's a very interesting topic and discussion. I thank all the speakers before me, and I thank all the speakers who will come after me, because it will be very interesting. They're all covering the same spectrum. It is like a sheet, wet sheet. You capture one angle and then the whole bed sheet comes. Climate change is like that. No? So I thank all the speakers who will be speaking after me also. So first, I have just 3-4 points to make. The first point is India is on track to meet Paris Agreement. I'll give the latest numbers, 2019 numbers. 2016, you must have heard. 19, we are already 34.5% below 2019 numbers. And still we have a decade to go, please. The second thing is that there is always, my mom has told me that please appreciate if somebody is doing good. So I think let the word appreciate India know that we have been doing good. I do not like silence, people keeping quiet, oh, that's okay. No, it's not okay. It requires efforts. It requires resources. It requires challenge. It requires sustainable development to go along with this. So we have to be appreciative. Appreciative. That is first point. The second point is, as Gauri said, I also help India along with some of my colleagues sitting here to prepare its biennial update report to the UN. I'm also a lead investigator for the UN who checks up the inventory of all the developed countries. So we know some numbers. So the thing is, India has at least 450 policies at federal and state and local level, 450 policies. And this is not all. I'll just tell solar, which people have been talking about, that we have 450 gigawatt renewable. This comprises only 10 policies. Out of 450, there's only 10 policies. So you can understand the depth and coverage what we have. Energy efficiency, perform, achieve, trade, 13 sectors, 956 industrial units, 956, it's a big number, which is last time when we counted, we could reduce 62 million ton CO2 in the second quarter. We are reducing, going on reducing. Renewable energy, of course, we know we will be touching 450. I'm not going to repeat that. EV, electric vehicles, 30% by 2030, all new vehicles. We have Euro 6 already from 1st March 2020 already implemented. We have coal, which is supplying 72% of our energy, but it is running only at 50% PLF. So coal is slowly going down, but we cannot say that this will go down because coal requires a different treatment. LED, LPG, water, what all, in every sector we have been touching, we have been doing great work. This is, I'm not saying because I have to say from Indian perspective, I'm saying because I know what others are doing, what others are not doing. I know both the things. Then with these 450 policies, with every policy behind that policy, there is a market connect. Market connect and support, that is very important. People don't realize, countries all over the world do not realize that there are very, very active policies. For example, in water itself, to clean the Ganges River, there are 55 industrial houses working on private sector mode, 55. And this is just one example. For agriculture, there are so many things that are happening in India. So my point is, I invite Europe, I invite European countries to come over and join in our investment, join in our clean investment. Please, please come over. We need a lot of money. We need about $150 billion in next 5 years. I have all the numbers I can give you. $180 billion. So this is a investment destination for climate. I'm not saying we want to make money. We want to develop together, Europe and India. The potential is huge. Ambassador was talking about bilateral, multilateral. There are 27 EU countries sitting, and each country is specializing in something or the other. Netherlands in water. Why don't you join our water networks? Please, we can provide you all the list of this 450 and plus policies and market. So this is second point. The third point is a little tricky point, I would like to say. I have never understood till date why industrialized countries are not paying $100 billion per year from 2020 onwards. I have not understood. I check up their reports. I check up their reports to UNFCCC, financial transfers. I know everything in detail. Let us not tell these things, but why they don't do it? It is a matter of faith. It's a matter of goodwill, which has to be done, India, I can tell you no. And second thing I don't understand is between 1990 to 2019, if you count USA, EU, take out USSR, because USSR fell in 1990 by 50%, not because of climate action, because of the economic downfall. The emissions have reduced by only 2% between 1990 and 2019 for all these industrialized countries. I have the numbers, sir. I can give you all the numbers. This is the numbers given by the countries themselves to UNFCCC. I've taken from there. 2% only. Why? What are we talking about? What are we talking about? So these are the two things which I am not able to get the answer. The third thing, the last point before I stop, India is considered an elephant. A dancing elephant, big elephant, elephant. Elephants never forget, sir. Madam, let us understand. Elephants never forget. They forget never. So whatever others have done or not done, we remember. We may not say so, but we remember. So let us tango, let us work together, let us not compete, let us collaborate. I think the word is very short memory in a way, but we have long memory, we have long history, we remember. So let us move in a positive track. Let us move to take the world out of this mess. So the last point, I think I will make one last point. We are at 3.3 billion ton of CO2 today, 3.3 billion ton per year. We will peak around 2040, and we will peak at around 4.5 billion ton. 4.5 billion ton will peak around. By 2050, we cannot go down below 2.5 billion ton. This is all scenarios I've seen. We do a lot of scenario exercise. We are part of almost all the scenario teams in the world. 2.5 billion ton by 2050 cannot go down. So this is just one number I'm saying because the world loves net zero. The world loves net zero peaking, not for India. Or if it is for India, we have to really frame it well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This is really been interesting, and especially for a European audience, I think we need to hear all of this sitting here. We don't hear it every day. So we're quite privileged to hear all your points very succinctly put. Gurchi, I will directly pass to you. I know we're running out of time a bit, but I'm finding this debate extra interesting. So we can move a bit of the time of the second panel, and then we'll conclude shortly. But let's carry on. Gurchi, please, over to you.
Thanks, Gauri. Thanks for the organizers for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. Great to hear already leaders being mentioned. Industrial transition also occurred several times. So I'll try to address those issues and talk about the importance of international cooperation in this area, and say a few words about our work. And indeed, the industry accounts for at least 30% of global CO2 emissions. So these emissions have been continuing to significantly grow globally. And this really places an imperative on industrial actors to globally reduce emissions sharply for the world to limit the global warming well below 2 degrees as required by the Paris Agreement, of course. And global momentum wouldn't lead it. We have been observing it for a while, and global momentum on industrial transition is growing significantly. Public-private sector stakeholders across the world are taking steps to decarbonize their sector. Many nations are making industrial transition a top priority. There are many countries that are putting in place roadmaps in the form of visions, pathways, and action plans that provide advanced decision aids for policymakers. We have gathered all these roadmaps from G20 countries at our website, so I'll drop a link to that. And meanwhile, companies such as FL Smith, who's already active in India, and Hybrid are setting examples and setting net zero targets for promoting ultra-low carbon technologies. We have also seen in the recent years development of much needed international collaboration to catalyze industry transition. So countries or companies are increasingly working together to find policy frameworks that are workable and incentives. LEADIT forms an example of such a collaborative initiative, and it gathers together, as mentioned before, around 31 members, with the US joining. that have, these are countries and companies that have an aim to decarbonize industry and achieve net zero emissions by 2050. And indeed, this initiative is led by Sweden and India, and it was launched under the UN Climate Action Summit. So we work very closely within the group under the leadership of India and Sweden, and the initiative is supported by the World Economic Forum. Now, LEADER provides an area for public-private cooperation. There are opportunities for sectoral and cross-sectoral learning, for example, when it comes to innovation opportunities and new technologies. And it's not only LEADER. Alongside LEADER, efforts to build international collaboration on industry transition is gaining speed through mission-oriented partnerships. Such as Mission Possible Partnership. Mission Innovation is also launching an industry mission under the leadership of Austria, who recently also joined LEADER. And then we have groups of first movers like the Climate Group, Roadmap to 2050, and Clean Energy Ministerial, again with strong partnership and support and leadership with India and UK. They're also launching new missions and new ambitions towards building coalitions and work towards the green public procurement. So industry transition is also gaining importance in the mind map and work of energy ministers around the world, not just industry ministers. So yes, there's a growing momentum, and there are development of low carbon alternatives are emerging, but these are harder to abate sectors. We know it's technically possible for steel, aluminum, chemicals, plastics, metals, mining, aviation, heavy-duty transport to decarbonize. We know it's technically feasible, but it will not be easy. We really need systematic shifts to reduce emissions from these heavy industries, with increasing recycling, circularity, with reducing demand, with material efficiency, increasing energy efficiency across the entire value chain, but also reducing both combustion and process emissions from primary and secondary production routes. Now, these are major shifts, and they will require large public support and strong participation of private stakeholders. So LEADER's theory of change is indeed based on the insight that industry stands together, and they stand a greater chance of success if they work in partnership. At our last summit in December 2020, LEADER members endorsed a statement and to commit to an urgent and collective action, in particular in the areas for supporting and realizing the business case for transition and diffusing climate technologies and know-how. Now, towards COP26, we are working in expanding LEADER membership. This is in progress, but we focus on engaging with more countries from developing countries, so the global south and company members. And we're also exploring pathways to promote sustainable green procurement. That's also very high on our agenda to support industry transition. And we're expanding our sectoral work because we need to have a value chain approach to include clusters and linkages between producers, manufacturers, and consumers. And we're also launching an interactive how-to roadmap guide. With that, we'll be providing support to road mapping processes in several developing countries. I'll stop here. I can say a lot more, but I hope we'll have time to discuss. I'll keep my intervention brief and really look forward to questions. Thank you.
I'm just going to push you a little bit because I'm personally curious on this. As you mentioned, these are very hard to abate sectors, and will require a medley of solutions, circularity, a value chain approach, material efficiency, and so on. Sweden, where you're based, has already started producing green steel with its hydrogen-based steel making, hybrid. So we see these technologies emerging in Europe, and there are quite a few also which use CCUS. Does LEADER have mechanisms for technology transfer of technologies which are being developed in Europe on industrial transition to developing countries like not only India but other countries? Are there such mechanisms, and what would they cost?
So this work actually on kind of innovation, hopefully will come with the work of mission innovation. As I mentioned, they are launching a new mission on industry transition. For Lead It, we really participate in the space in a way that we complement existing initiatives. So more focus on R&D and supporting technological innovation in other countries will come with their work. And of course, the Mission Possible Partnership also provides a platform. What we do, on the other hand, is we did have plans, of course, COVID didn't permit it. We did have plans to invite stakeholders from India, technology developers, companies, businesses to hybrid to see the plan, to see how it works and share those insights. We didn't have the chance to do that. Within our working groups, we of course exchange news and updates on different decarbonization pathways, and go deeper into the challenges and barriers and the need for public policy support. That's where our sort of guidance comes. I also shared a link to a green transition tracker that we have just launched. So we are also tracking what sort of different technologies are employed to produce the green steel, what are the investments and money and put in green steel. So we're tracking those and we're sharing those with our members. But I would say our guidance is more, let's say, rooted in sharing public policy experiences, sharing more and more. We're moving to the direction of sharing experience with setting standards, the need for certification schemes, which seems to be the barriers as to make these green steel investments and to make a green steel trade international. So that's kind of the next step where we are sitting.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Please do check out the Green Steel Tracker. It's quite impressive. I've been pouring into it. Let me quickly move on to the next participants. Dr. Navroz Dubash, who is professor at Center for Policy Research in Delhi, which is a Delhi-based think tank. He's been actively engaged in global and national debates on climate change, air quality, energy, water, and is also coordinating lead author for the 6th assessment report of the IPCC UNEP gap report, of the IPCC assessment report. Dr. Dubash has written quite a bit on India's low carbon transition. If I'm not mistaken, there's been a very interesting article published just yesterday on what might be a low carbon pathway, net zero pathway maybe for India by 2050, if that is even possible. And then we will go directly to Susanna Karp, who is Political Strategy Director at Bellona Europe. She's worked on climate and energy policy in the EU for many, many years and has successfully led, and I've been witness to that, many important climate change campaigns with the UN institutions. Dr. Dubash, you've also maybe read the Bloomberg report on net zero by 2050. What do you think? What will be India's net zero pathway? Is it possible? What about a just transition? So handing over to you, and then Susanna will speak upon what is seen as a bit of a controversial topic, which is at least internationally on carbon border adjustment mechanisms. But as we've heard Mr. Vanheukelen say, it would be WTA compatible. So let's dive deeper into that.
Great. Thank you so much, Gauri. I'm delighted to be part of this very august panel. And I was very glad to hear the ambassador and the past speakers, my colleagues from India, as well as colleagues from SEI. And I look forward to hearing the next speaker as well. I'm afraid I'm going to use the crutch of a couple of slides and try and do this quite briskly. In response to your point, you had asked me to talk a little bit about net zero, and I will. But I just want to talk around sort of 4 broad points. A little bit about picking up from what Arnava has also said, something around sort of the shifts in India's climate politics. If I have time, I'll talk about what has worked, but I might skip that in the interest of time, get to some of the net zero conversations, and then talk about how we might think about reframing climate opportunities, which will also echo what both Arunabha and Amit have said. So, I like to think about Indian climate politics sort of proceeding in three acts here. And the first is encapsulated by this cartoon that was doing the rounds way back in 1990, right? It's a very famous report called Global Warming in an Unequal World. And there's a wealthy looking person in a big car. And because it's a big car, we presume it's an American rather than a European. So that's the good news. And he's saying, yo, amigo, we need to protect that tree to protect us from the greenhouse effect, right? So it was really the north-south politics of who caused this problem was what dominated Indian climate politics for a long time. Fast forward to around, say, the year 2010, around Copenhagen, and India started talking a lot about co-benefits, right? All the things that we should be doing anyway to build cleaner cities, to develop green jobs and so on, and how those things would help us with climate mitigation. And I'm very fond of this cartoon, which basically has people like us at a podium talking about all these benefits, and someone in the audience says, what if it's a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? And it's sort of a tongue-in-cheek thing to say, well, look, there's not necessarily a trade-off. And this was around the moment that India created its National Action Plan and started really building on the co-benefits agenda, and some of the results that subsequently came out on solar power and so on are a result of that, many of the things that Professor Garg talked about. Now, fast forwarding again to maybe a couple of years ago, and the Indian media has started talking about a climate crisis. The Hindustan Times, for example, the second largest circulation Indian paper, says it no longer will use the word climate change. It will talk only about climate crisis and climate emergency. And there's a sense in which climate change per se is also becoming very much part of the conversation. So there has been a shifting discourse. I wouldn't want to say that climate change as an issue has reached the level of being a voting issue in the way it has in Europe. I think the center of gravity is still with that co-benefits language. But it does mean that both diplomatically and developmentally, climate change looms much larger in India today. Does this mean then that India is ready to jump on board with the sort of bold 2050 net zero pledge? And Gauri referred to the Bloomberg piece. Look, that was sort of a speculative piece. The reporter talked to me and several others on this call, I'm sure, about the sort of conversation that was happening. And it led to a flurry of articles, and quite interesting articles. Many of us on this call wrote some of those articles. But I think it's important to take stock of some of the learnings from the last month and a half or so around that, right? So I've chosen to put up here one modeling study, and I put it up there because it is the IEA, and therefore it is an international study, not an Indian study. And what they did, the IEA did in their recent India report, is they looked at different.
We can't hear you, Dr. Dubash.
Okay.
Yeah, it's okay now.
Okay, great. Between the business as usual scenario and the so-called sustainable development scenarios. Now, in India's case, the sustainable development scenario would get India to net zero by about 2065, so not even 2050, right? And what I want to point out here is the angle of change for India is so much greater than it is for just about any other part of the world, and certainly much greater than any of the developed countries, right? So for India to get to net zero would mean this enormous shift, a 90-degree shift basically in trajectory over a very short period. And I think Weber from CEW will talk a little bit more about this. But the point is there are many studies that show just how big the ask would be. And the question is, we are increasingly talking about climate change as an opportunity, and I think that's the right language to use. But what these models make us think about is whether we can rule out whether a hard net zero target by 2050 and this kind of deviation would have implications for India in terms of our development chances. And I think we cannot rule that out, right? So net zero would be great. but can it be on the back of India's poor? No, right? So we have to be cautious about this as people who advise policymakers. About whether we should be thinking about just mitigation pathways, which is what net zero framings are, or whether we should be thinking about low carbon development pathways, echoing again, and this is really a broad consensus emerging in India now, that we need to be thinking about low carbon pathways that also bring jobs, investment opportunities, air pollution gains, and so on. What do those low carbon pathways look like? And do we get there by talking about net zero, or do we get there by using some other language? Particularly as India's emissions are still rising, right? So the key for India is to avoid locking in to high carbon pathways, which is in a sense a preliminary stage prior to thinking about net zero. The models also tell us the investment needs for any such transition are going to be enormous, and we have to have some sense of where that comes from. And finally, I'll just sort of say that, you know, I'm not among those who necessarily dismisses the idea of net zero. I think it's been very powerful politically. I think it could be powerful politically in the developing world as well. But we have to stay away from a simplistic unitary net zero by 2050 story. We need to think about credible and just transitions in the plural to net zero. And this is the piece that Gauri alluded to that's just come out in The Conversation, which is an online publication just yesterday. And I'm happy to share the link if anybody's interested. So I'm going to skip this slide in the interest of time. It just talks about what policies have worked and what haven't worked. But I want to throw up something from a forthcoming paper that I have. It's a bit of a complicated slide, but we looked at modeling studies done in India, a range of them, and the predictions they make, or the projections rather they make for 2050. And I'm not going to get into this, but I want to show you is that both in energy and in carbon intensity terms, they are all over the place, right? And that's not an indictment of the modeling studies. All it means is that there are future trajectories of development for India. There are many future Indias in 2050. We have choices about how we go in terms of energy intensity, in terms of carbon intensity, and the choices we make now will shape which of these colored dots we more accurately map our future, right? And these dots also represent, the size of the dots actually represent GDP. So they also project different GDP futures for India. So India is in a very interesting place. Unlike the EU or the US, which have built out their infrastructures, or even China, we haven't built out our development future yet. We could go in a number of directions. And that is actually the conversation we need to be having in India. We need to be reframing climate change as an opportunity to think about how to lock in a low carbon future and lock out a high carbon future. And talking about mitigation won't help us do that. We have to talk about the development pathway. A lot of our emissions futures are going to be shaped by our choices around industrialization and around urbanization. It isn't actually only about renewable energy uptake. There are much broader development choices that matter. The investment needs, as I said, are likely to be considerable. And we have a very strong need for a strong state capacity to manage this transition. So what does this then mean for what India should say internationally? I think, you know, I haven't gone down the road of saying how India can project leadership, but I think we can based on what we have done and the stories we can tell. But I think the really important thing for India then is to come up with strong sectoral pledges. What is our industrialization strategy? What is our electricity future? What is our urbanization future? And so on. That is what is going to both allow India to lock in low carbon futures, but very importantly, build political support for doing so. Let's be clear, in India, political support for low carbon futures comes if we can build it on the back of jobs and other development benefits, including local air pollution benefits. We probably have to have an enhanced 2030 economy-wide pledge. And I'm glad to see at the Climate Leaders Summit that the conversation has shifted a little bit from only talking about 2050 to talking about what you need to do in 2030. And I think that's actually a really important message for the EU. We need stronger institutions and state capacity, and we can talk in aspirational ways about net zero. But a message for the EU coming out of what I would like to say here is that calling for only net zero, and particularly by 2050, as a benchmark for ambition, for climate ambition, is too narrow a framing. We need a more elastic framing. The idea of just transitions to net zero is a broadening of the idea. And I really encourage sort of our friends in the EU to think about these pathways in this more elastic way discussed here. For those of you interested, we've edited a volume that brings together a lot of voices in India active on this debate, and you can just, it's a freely downloadable volume. Please feel free to check it out if you have a chance. Thanks very much, and I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Susanna.
Yes, good morning and good afternoon to those in India. It is certainly not an overstatement when I say that I'm truly honored to be part of this policy dialogue, and I'd like to thank Gauri and the Brussels School of Governance for inviting me. I'd also like to thank the previous speakers for the extremely relevant and action-oriented remarks. And a lot of what I will say now will actually build and refer to many of the points previously made. So I hope that that will open up a chance to exchange a bit after the presentations. So the topic for as Gauri introduced it is the carbon border adjustment mechanism. But I do need to start from the EU Green Deal to talk about it, because from the very onset of this project, although it's called a European Green Deal, it has always actually been thought and designed to be a global project, or a project for a global audience. So we have heard from the very beginning that we are aiming to become the first climate neutral continent. Now that's already, the geographical scope of this project already speaks about regional solutions at continental level in the case of Europe, but certainly regional solutions to meet a global challenge. And in talking about the whole European continent, what the EU has talked about is also about its neighbors. That makes all the sense. We are connected with those sharing a border with us through the electricity grid, as well as through flows which are which create actually the European landscape. So what I want to stress out is that this project, when it was first presented, it actually offered a governance model at regional level to meet global goals. And the carbon border adjustment mechanism, in that sense, is quite a critical element. To some extent, it has been seen by others as, let's say, sealing the deal, meaning perhaps Europe is trying to seal itself from the rest of the world. But my contribution today will seek to demonstrate that what the EU has actually proposed with the carbon border adjustment mechanism is a collaborative, competitive approach to meeting the carbon neutrality goals of the Paris Agreement, keeping in mind the differentiated pathways that Professor Dubash referred to just now. So in a way, it is sealing the deal, but it seeks to seal the Paris Agreement commitments and the global approach to collaborating despite the very different circumstances the different regions of the world have. Now, of course, when there are such different landscapes, everyone has already heard about this risk of carbon leakage. And the interesting thing and the interesting shift in focus we're seeing is that whereas before the Paris Agreement, there was the idea that industries may seek to relocate to avoid climate policies, this makes very little sense in the context of the Paris Agreement. And certainly the net zero pledges in the last year have also pretty much spoken that different countries around the world have confirmed that they are aiming for the same goal. And therefore, while they will take different pathways, nonetheless, the globe as such will seek to become carbon neutral by the second half of the century, meaning there's little sense in relocating, let's say, industries now and aiming for the lowest or for loopholes to avoid this, when in fact it's a global effort, it's a shared effort. And the carbon border adjustment mechanism actually operates on the opposite principle, extending the handout to ensure that the competitive race is a collaborative one, seeking for either the highest common denominator, or for an average common denominator between the highest standards and the lowest standards. So shifting the paradigm and the focus away from where is this topic least regulated to how can we ensure regulation will more or less give us either, so in any case, a beneficial race to the top. Now, I want to briefly speak about 3 critical elements that confirm this theory that have recently emerged from the Carbon Border Adjustment report voted by a majority of the European Parliament just in March 2021. There are 3 elements in that report that indicate that indeed the CBAM in the EU's Green Deal is not about closing countries out. It's not about, let's say, punishing other countries or excluding them from the EU single market, but rather it's about a complete shift in paradigm and proposing regional solutions to meet global goals. The first such element is that this Parliament report proposes methodologies to actually incorporate a full life cycle carbon and environmental footprint through a full life cycle assessment, starting, from extraction to manufacturing to use and to transport. So this is quite a change. And if we think about what this means in terms of what it proposes, it quite clearly looks to close loopholes on or to make carbon that is currently unseen to become visible, because we can't expect to be meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement while we still have the issue of unaccounted CO2 or CO2 that doesn't have a carbon price necessarily, but in any case we need extremely rigorous accounting of emissions if we are to effectively have a global standard, let's say, or a global effort to meet the Paris Agreement. So that's an important change. The second important change in perspective is that it proposed covering a whole range of sectors. It no longer allowed the debate to be about, and here I refer to articles from maybe 2019, but one country slamming tariffs on steel from other countries. So it's not about that anymore. All of a sudden, we're having a holistic approach, looking at the whole range of sectors covered, in this case, by the EU ETS, which does make sense from the perspective of legal symmetry. But nonetheless, if you think about the scope of these industries, so it goes from fertilizers to refineries to cement to glass, so effectively chemicals, everything in the EU ETS, including electricity. And if you apply the accounting rule mentioned above to the requirement to tax electricity, we're all of a sudden looking at very interesting dimensions with very clear implications on, let's say, grid development, grid design going forward. But nonetheless, these are approaches that demonstrate that the EU's CBAM is very much about creating global standards, asking to have a collaborative competition, and asking for accounting and a full coverage of sectors. So therefore, one could actually speak of a global level playing field, not just one for a certain industry or another. And lastly, the CBAM proposed goes beyond covering just commodities to also covering intermediary products, and so carbon embedded in intermediary products. And final end product. So it's quite, again, it goes in the same direction with the previous 2 points, but it's to show that this is very much about closing loopholes on carbon flows that become unaccounted for. It's really about setting global standards on how to account and look at embedded carbon, and asking for full coverage and disclosure on where and how the carbon is moving. So quite interesting. And there are several perspectives emerging from that. I won't go into all of them, but I will share with you what I think is the most important perspective that this opens up. First of all, on the topic of hydrogen, presuming that we, let's say, apply the proposed methodologies on our energy imports, which is quite a clear, that there's clear indications in the Parliament report that this would happen, we would actually have a situation where green hydrogen made in India has an opportunity to set the global standard on sustainability criteria for green hydrogen, which would then create a race to the top back in the EU, where currently we're struggling to define these clear sustainability standards. And at least for the perspective of many NGOs, for us, additional renewables and grid created for this purpose would be a key criteria, but we can learn and learn from India in this regard, and the CBAM would help. Secondly, I think the sustainable mining component, this is of a global reach perhaps, but certainly because CO2 emissions from extraction are also included, we can start talking about having sustainability criteria from a range of activities that apply to and would require to be changed and made more sustainable for a profound industrial transformation. And lastly, because of the climate impact of different processes and stages of processes is taken into account, we can actually speak of circularity developing with a view to reducing the climate impact. So there is a risk in circularity discussions that simply focusing on resource efficiency could actually, in some cases, lead to an increase in CO2, whereas what we're having now in the strategic document report voted on by the European Parliament is actually an approach that could form the basis of a model for circularity that develops at the global level with a view to minimizing CO2 impact as well. And I think all of these perspectives are extremely relevant, and I hope we can hopefully in the EU carry on the discussions in these terms with the global perspective in mind. So I will stop here, and I look forward to discussing with the speakers and the participants. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Susanna. I will quickly just allow the Indian speakers to pose a question to you, and then take just one question from the participants. Sorry for that. Before we go on to the next panel, I know we're running a bit late, but again, it's very, very interesting for me, at least. So any of the Indian participants, speakers would like to?
Yeah. Thank you, Susanna, for a very interesting concept. We have been pushing for this consumption-based accounting for many years, and we failed miserably. Because consumption-based is very difficult. For example, we should know how much carbon is embedded in this ball of glass, how much carbon is embedded in this pen, how much carbon is embedded in this pen. It is extremely difficult. Maybe Europe itself has 650 steel-making technologies, Europe itself. So to create a benchmark for Europe itself will be difficult, not to talk about all over the world. So this carbon border adjustment, I don't know, because you said you're talking about various sectors, embedded carbon. I think it's a landmine. It's a landmine because it is not possible to do it. The whole IPCC and EU system has been created for production-based accounting. That is why China is 25% global emissions. If you take consumption-based, China will be hardly 12%. So I think we have to be extremely careful before putting something like this, because this is going to be criticized, and even by Europeans and Americans, they may not like it, because to change the accounting principle from production-based to consumption-based is going to be extremely challenging. Thank you very much.
Susanna, would you like to come back to that?
Yes, indeed. So I just want to say that, first of all, the carbon border adjustment debate has been around for a very long time. And I know that you're all familiar with this. But it has actually been included in the EU ETS already in 2008, because the possibility of including imports into the EU ETS has already been enshrined in the directive. So in a sense, you're right that the focus so far has been on accounting for production emissions. But already for more than 12 years, the direction of travel for the EU's mechanism for accounting for emissions has been to account for imports as well. That is one aspect of it. And the second aspect of it is that, of course, the methodologies for full accounting are incredibly difficult and challenging to develop, but it doesn't mean they must necessarily from the onset be 100% the final version of them. We see throughout policies and policy development in general is a self-improving process. We're also learning with every policy that we implement, and we have the chance to then learn from let's say what has been constructive, and we can build from simplicity towards more complex models over time. It doesn't need to mean that overnight we go to the most granular level of CO2 accounting, but in my view, I don't think we can expect to fully meet the Paris Agreement, which actually does make a claim on effectively greenhouse gas emissions contributing to climate change at large. So I don't think we can genuinely meet it or know where we are until we actually know the extent of the carbon flow we're actually looking at when we decide what happens with our goods, our products, and so on. So will this be very, very difficult? Yes, absolutely. Will this be the most difficult thing about meeting the challenges of the Paris Agreement? Probably not. Thank you.
Yeah, just very quickly to Dr. Dubash, and then we open the debate to the panelists. So if the the attendants. So if you want to ask a question, please raise your hand and I will come to you. So Dr. Dubash, and very quickly, and Susanna, just a two-line answer to that. Thanks.
Okay, I'll be very quick. So I think we all agree it's complicated. What I want to focus on is the need for it, right? So from the academic literature, it suggests that empirical evidence of leakage is really limited. It just doesn't seem to be a big factor. It doesn't seem to actually have competitiveness issues. So is it worth all the transaction costs?
So having worked on this topic in Brussels for several years now, I can say that what industry will respond to that is it hasn't happened so far because there has been carbon leakage protection in place. Now, of course, in the context of net zero, how would leakage look like? But certainly we can already learn from what has happened around the EU with the increase of the carbon price. And we have noticed that over the past 3 years, there has been a direct correlation between the increase in the price on per ton of CO2 in the power sector and the imports that the EU has made on electricity from its neighboring countries, boosting up demand in countries in the Western Balkans for possibly building new coal plants for a way to satisfy the demand. We've also increased our imports for electricity from Russia. And this is just to say that this has been the one sector that hasn't received carbon leakage protection, at least not in the last couple of years. And where there hasn't been carbon leakage protection in place, we have seen a correlation, a direct correlation between the increases in imports and the increase of the carbon price. Now, of course, not all industries are equally exposed to this because some have a more regional dimension given their, let's say, requirements for transport. So, for example, cement, but that doesn't change the fact that the EU does offer, let's say, a systemic approach, a regional approach, continental approach for the global debates and seeks to involve its partners around the world. This is good because it avoids the development of carbon havens outside of the EU, and many of the speakers here on this panel are concerned with air quality and many other forms of pollution, and it certainly wouldn't be appropriate to pursue a most ambitious climate policy internally while at the same time risking the development of extremely dirty, let's say, air or electricity to support, let's say, the production of the goods we're importing in the EU. So I think this is a responsible approach, and I think it's an invitation to ensure that the competition, which is embedded in this very process, will actually take the form of cooperation for global standards.
Okay, I will go to Ms. Camilla Fenning. So please be very brief, and then Susanna, and then we move into the next panel immediately.
Thank you very much, and a really, really interesting discussion. I work for E3G, which is a climate change think tank. I'm on secondment from the British government, and I work with the COP26 Energy Transition Council as well, which is collaborating with India on energy transition. My question is recognizing the sort of huge success that India is having in terms of its renewables, but around coal. And I noted that yesterday the India Power Secretary, Mr. Alok Kumar, stated, and quoting here, the share in electricity generated by coal in total generation is projected to decline continuously. And I wanted to ask the panel, what decisions, policies and pathways will be needed to stop new coal in India and retire existing coal in order to meet a net zero ambition? Could panelists envision a no new coal initiative, perhaps by COP26, or a moratorium of the 70 coal power plants in the pipeline at the moment? Thank you.
Okay, who would like to take that one?
I'll take a stab at it, and then I think Navroz. Oh, sorry, Navroz, you want to go ahead?
Mr. Dubar, sorry, Arunabha, you can go ahead, and then we go to Dr. Dubash.
Okay, great. Camilla, thanks for that question. You're right that the share of electricity generated from coal power plants will keep declining. Professor Garg even mentioned the already very low plant load factors at which the coal fleet is operating. So before I actually directly answer your question, let us also recognize things that are happening. Just in the past year, since the pandemic began, the coal fleet was forcibly turned down while renewables was given the must-run status. So that even while there is an impact on the overall power sector, the preference was driven clearly towards renewables. For the last 5 years, my organization, along with the IEA, puts out the annual investment trends report. And we found that the last 5 years and counting, the investments in renewables continues to outpace that in thermal power. Okay. So now if we have to look into the future, I would break up the response in 3 parts. One is, what do we do with the very old coal power plants? What do we do with the relatively more efficient coal power plants? And what do we do with potentially future coal power plants? Now, the answer to the last is actually relatively easy because the market will sort itself out. We already have renewables tariffs at historic lows. Even if you added the cost of storage, it would still be relatively cost competitive with certain coal power plants, etc. So it's very, very unlikely, unless someone has money to just throw and lose, it's very unlikely for new coal power plants to come up. That then leaves us with the legacy of the thermal power sector. And there I would look at those that are plants that are older than 25 years and older, plants that are somewhere in the 10 to 25 years vintage, and those that are lesser than 10 years old. A lot of the way in which, and Navroz knows more than me on this, is the way in which our power sector is designed. We've locked ourselves in the past with power procurement agreements for state-run utilities to buy a lot of power from state-run power plants, which are older and therefore also less efficient. Now, there has to be a plan of action to gradually shut them down, even as the newer, more efficient fleet then is able to ramp up so that you're emitting less for every unit of power generated. So you can actually break down this whole problem into these 3 parts, but underlying all of this is going to be the just transition. If you have 500,000 coal mine workers or people employed in thermal power plants, those are, let's be clear, 500,000 families, right? So about somewhere in the order of 2.5 million to 3 million people. Now, if I look at Germany, there's a 40 billion euro plan for the just transition of people employed in the coal sector, right? 40 billion euros in one European country. So, I don't mean it just in tongue in cheek, but give us 40 billion euros and we'll figure it out, the coal transition for India. Right? But the point is, we don't even need 40 billion euros, but we do need a serious conversation about what will be the voluntary retirement of these workers, what will be the retraining plan for these workers, what will be the social safety net for these workers, even as our estimates shows that eventually renewables will have far more jobs created, whether off-grid or grid connected, than from coal. So the problem is not actually about the future at all. It is about the absence of a serious conversation about the legacy infrastructure, where our needs are somehow looked very differently than how Germany looks at it, or where UK, the host of the COP26, is busy thinking of opening up a new coal mine. So let's have a granular discussion on this, and we've been doing plant by plant analysis, and we can figure it out.
Okay, Dr. Dubash, very quickly, and then Professor Garg as well, and then we run to the next session. Thanks.
Yeah, when you want to shut down a session quickly, it's probably not the best time to bring up the coal transition, but we are in the position we are in. Thanks also for the question, Camilla. Look, I approach this as an independent academic part of this conversation about India and India's energy and climate, as well as global climate futures. And from that perspective, I think absolutely we need to be having a conversation about the future of coal in India, because not just from a global point of view, but from a point of view, as Arnab alluded to, the fact that there is writing on the wall here about the future of coal, and it is incumbent on us to try and make sure that the livelihoods, and it's not just the labor and their families, but it's also the communities that they're embedded within, and all the sort of secondary economic gains to those communities from the coal economy, to make sure that all of those vulnerable people are well taken care of. So, I'm going to try and build a little bit, not repeat what Arnab said. I broadly agree with all of that. The fact is that a conversation about a future point B that is better than point A, where we are now, the fact that that point B exists doesn't mean that it's seamless to get there. So in addition to the PPAs, we have a set of entrenched issues around railways and the financing of railways, public sector banks, and all kinds of other sort of broader economy-wide entanglements within which the coal economy is embedded, including the way in which our distribution companies are structured. Now, we have to start untangling all of those things. But let me turn this around, right? Climate politics often doesn't help engage questions in all their complexity. So India is now being asked in forceful terms, will you or will you not take your 450 gigawatt renewable energy pledge that is a domestic pledge and make it an international pledge, right? With the assumption being that that will be consistent with a net zero trajectory. For those of us who work internally in India, there's a very vibrant discussion going on as to whether it makes sense to actually have a 450 gigawatt pledge, or whether it makes more sense to frame the conversation around the accelerated decarbonization of electricity in practice, not just building renewables, but actually creating the conditions to use them and retire coal faster. So sometimes the global conversation forces an artificial kind of constraint on the domestic conversation. So I think bringing coal, so my short answer to you is bringing coal into the conversation is something I support. Asking for hard pledges right now, given the state of flux of the sector and the complexity and the possible economic costs, is something harder to manage, right? So let's have a conversation about more rapid decarbonization of electricity, which will also be really good from an air pollution point of view. And let's use the international process to drive those conversations, but let's not use the international conversations to try and force countries into giving prematurely robust numerical targets. And this is really something that comes out of the EU, right? the way in which the EU governance structure works. You sit in Brussels, you come up with a target, you use that target to force decisions through the EU governance structure into national economies. That's not how it works in India. It's not a target-driven governance system. We don't actually have a great way of mapping our achievements to those targets. So I think it's really important not to assume that the rest of the world, the governance structures in the rest of the world operate like they do in the EU. It's not, targets don't lead actions in India. Actions actually lead and targets follow, right? But we actually get things done that way. So let's bring coal on the table, but in the more nuanced way that I think we're trying to talk about here.
Thanks, Camilla. I'll just take, I think, 1 minute because both my previous speakers have already set the stage. I would say coal is the big elephant in the world, not only in India, it is in the world. And let us please remember, we had a Montreal Protocol for CFC. Why don't we have a protocol for coal? Global protocol. We are just talking about India. No country, let me say, no power is better than any power. We need power. We cannot live without power. And if energy security, energy affordability, energy access is through coal, let it be. Let it be. So the world has to come to conversation that, okay, what does the world do for coal? You please understand, coal is not only India's problem. It is USA problem, Germany problem, Japan problem, China problem, South Africa problem, Australia problem, everybody's problem. So why don't we discuss? Please stop putting one country on the mat, it will not help. India, I emphatically say, will not come out of coal for 20 years. And this is our all scenarios we have run because we don't have energy security. Where is the scale? We have 207 gigawatt of coal-based power. 207. Where is the battery backup of flow batteries at scale? It is not there. Does not exist, will not come for next 8 years. Then how can we do this? No. You want to increase the price of power by 3 times? No political party will survive in the country. No party. It is a complex social, economic, and political malice. So it is, let us talk about it, let us discuss it, and let us frame a global strategy. Please do not ask India alone what to do because there is a trade balance, there is a full balance all over the world. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much. We need to stop all the hands and the questions for now. So moving on to the next panelist very quickly, and sorry to keep the panelists waiting. We take a deeper dive now into sectoral decarbonization. So we look at what are the barriers and enablers on the road to Paris. So we also will talk about the financial structure supporting low carbon pathways. We take a look at different emission sectors such as transport, power, agriculture. And to begin with, we have Anna Gambau, if I pronounce that correctly. Anna is the EU Climate and Energy Correspondent for sorry, am I audible? Yeah, okay. For Carbon Pulse, she's based in Brussels, and she's been covering natural gas markets as well, with a focus on Central and Eastern Europe. And she's freelance with a number of very prestigious and worked as well for very prestigious outlets. And she's also my fellow alumna from the College of Europe. So I'm very happy to invite her. And following her, we have Auke Hoekstra, who is director at Neon researcher at Eindhoven University, and founder of Zenmo. He's sort of a guru, European guru on EVs and transport sector decarbonization. And you can follow him on Twitter. He has a huge following, and he really explains things very well. He's, as I mentioned, he's a researcher at Eindhoven University, and his goal is to help accelerate the transition to sustainable energy by really showing how and why this makes sense. So I hope he can do that for us now as well. Anna, I pass over to you and then to Auke.
Thank you very much, Gauri, for having me, for the introduction, and for allowing me to set the scene for this panel. So I'm a journalist. I'm perhaps the odd one out on this conference, but I just wanted to give perhaps this big picture perspective on the EU's climate policy challenges and all the carbon pricing initiatives coming up, as that's basically what I'm following on my everyday basis. So yes, I mean, perhaps a bit of the introduction of what the magnitude of the European Green Deal is and how far-reaching this is going to be. So we have set the EU has set the climate neutrality objective by 2050. It has also increased the EU's 2030 target. And now the challenge is to get like all the EU legislation to align with it. I mean, we're not only talking about climate policy and climate legislation only, but every single policy area. We're talking about competition, we're talking economic policy, transport, agriculture, industry, you name it, will need to be aligned to this new goal. And that's a very interesting legislative challenge ahead for the EU. There was a European Parliament report that was released, I think like yesterday, that said that the European Green Deal will need to adopt as many as 87 pieces of legislation and initiatives in the next couple of years. I mean, this is nowhere close to the 450 that Dr. Garg mentioned earlier in the case of India, but of course we're talking as, if you want to call it, only supranational level. Then afterwards, each one of the 27 member states will need to adopt its own legislation aligning it to this and their own standards and their own measures to hit their own targets. And overall, this is a massive puzzle. All the pieces will need to fit in together. The efforts to coordinate all policies and make them consistent with one another will be significant. And this in turn will need to come together with very intense climate diplomacy efforts and measures, including the carbon border adjustment mechanism, as we have just seen. Now, those of us who are following EU climate policy, we are all eagerly waiting for mid-July. That's when the European Commission is supposed to present its so-called Fit for 55 package, which aligns the current legislation with this 55% emissions reduction objective by 2030 that was submitted to the UNFCCC as part of the new NDC of the EU. One of its cornerstones, and not the only one, it's going to be carbon pricing. And I mean, in the EU, in the sense, has pioneered with the EU ETS, the EU emissions trading system. It was until up to now the world's largest trading system for the past 15 years. I mean, this year, China adopted its national ETS, which is larger in scope and volume, in volume at least. And the EU's carbon market has in recent months seen one record after the other. Yesterday, we saw EU carbon prices reaching 50 euro per ton. That's unprecedented. Polluting has never been as expensive and perhaps even unthinkable some months ago. I mean, we could talk about the fundamentals and the policies behind, but I think few of us were envisioning to be getting to 50 euro per ton as of now. Many see this as a time where the EU's carbon market is really working. It's contributed to the decarbonization, the gradual decarbonization of the EU's power sector and enabled this gradual switching away from coal, which I'm sure that my panelists fellow panelists will get more detail into this. And now we're getting closer to the price signal needed to enable industrial abatement, clean technology, green hydrogen, you name it. And now the ETS will be reformed in light of the new target, because of course a new 2030 target will mean a new cap on emissions towards the end of the decade. The reform once again will be massive, as I must have said earlier. We're talking about potentially new sectors that will be included, maritime emissions that could expand the volume of the market by almost 10%, depending on whether we take only intra-EU maritime or also ships leaving or entering EU ports to third countries. And maybe even carbon pricing may even be expanded to vehicles, to buildings, which that would bring almost half of the EU's total greenhouse gases into a carbon market. Now, that does not mean that carbon pricing will be the only tool that the EU is talking about. And the EU is talking about a mix of several regulatory and market-based tools. And of course, any carbon pricing initiative in these new sectors will need to come together with a number of, say, energy efficiency standards, CO2 standards for vehicles, etc. The scale of the challenge is significant. I mean, we've talked many times about the just transition, and of course, redistribution efforts, social justice, just transition will need to be more present than ever to ensure that nobody is left behind and that all the different starting points across EU member states are taken into account. These are perhaps my few words of introduction. I mean, I'm happy to continue discussing that later, but happy to hand over back to you, Gauri.
Yeah, sorry, thank you very much, Anna, and sorry for that. I would like to bring in actually Dr. Nilanjan Ghosh first. Before Auke, Dr. Ghosh is director at the Observer Research Foundation in Kolkata, and he's also been Senior Vice President Chief Economist at MCX Limited in Mumbai, Professor of Econometrics at TERI, visiting fellow at Linnaeus University, Sweden, and Stanford as well. So he's also worked on at the World Bank and has numerous, has written almost 8 books. Wow. So Anna, you've mentioned the European Green Deal and how it's going to become the chief financial instrument to transition to a low carbon economy by 2050, the net zero transition in the EU as well. Dr. Ghosh, a similar Green Deal exists in India? If not, how would you imagine it to be? So would really be interested in hearing your thoughts. I pass it over to you.
Thank you, Ms. Khandekar. Let me thank the organizers for inviting me to this extremely exciting discussion. In fact, it was absolutely exhilarating listening to the various esteemed speakers in the very first half, as also my previous speaker. Well, this is indeed a very interesting as well as a challenging topic to talk about the Indian Green Deal. As such, the European Green Deal, which aims to make the EU the world's first climate neutral bloc by 2050, extends to different sectors, including construction, biodiversity, energy, transport, food, and talks of various economic instruments, as also, in fact, the various legal statutes and legal instruments. Now, obviously, the question when we are talking about this kind of a platform, the question that you have posed in front of me is that whether India can really think of such a Green Deal. Now, last year, the Indian economy shrank, largely due to the lockdown as a response to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. And the confirmation of the negative relation of economic growth with the various environmental indicators got reinforced yet again during the lockdown, with all the environmental indicators showing signs of substantial improvement. And this can be witnessed with the increase in green cover, substantial improvements, in fact, in the air quality in the various urban centers, changes in both terrestrial and aquatic species, breeding behaviors, movements, attainment of better flow regimes, in fact, in the river systems. So the negative relation again goes on to reveal that India possibly is on the rising side of an environmental Kuznets curve, if that at all exists. Now, while talking of the EU or Indian Green Deal, one needs to differentiate between two important notions. One is green growth, the other is degrowth. It has already been accepted in many parts of the world that, rather generally accepted, that the attempts to nurture the current levels of growth are proving to be costly due to degradation and depletion of the natural ecosystem. This has not only created a dent on the ecosystem services, but actually been a deterrent for traditional cultural ethos that respects all forms of life on Earth. And however, there is no denying of the developing world's contribution to the process of depletion and degradation of the ambient environment because of a phenomenon that I often describe as growth fetishism of the developing and the underdeveloped world. Essentially, the developing and the underdeveloped world perceive development as a monodirectional movement of a single variable, that is GDP, gross domestic product, without considerations of broader issues of equity and sustainability, bringing that in the framework of the entire developmental discourse. Therefore, the notion of green growth started being accepted as a solution to prevent degradation of the natural environment and as a position that can reconcile the needs of development and conservation goals. Now, the very green growth hypothesis is contingent upon decoupling of the use of natural resources and economic growth. This implies that there has to be a factor that can substitute the incremental change in the natural resource use for meeting the growth targets. While often technological and institutional innovations are being talked of as factors for enhancing production efficiency, I'd like to pose this factor in terms of the words of political scientist Thomas Homer Dixon, ingenuity. Yet, however powerful ingenuity is, an undeniable fact of the present civilization is that human progress is inextricably linked with the use of one of the most fundamental forms of capital, that is natural capital. And in this context, the very decoupling of growth from the natural capital or resources provided by nature is practically and axiomatically impossible. And this is exhibited in a very recent paper, in 2016 paper in World Economy by Ward et al., where the authors, on the basis of an analytical macro model, infer, I'm just quoting them from here, that growth in GDP ultimately cannot plausibly be decoupled from growth in material and energy use, demonstrating categorically that GDP growth cannot be sustained indefinitely. It is therefore misleading to develop growth-oriented policy around the expectation that decoupling is possible, end quote. It is here that I'd like to state that the very notion of green growth is an oxymoron. Growth is necessarily brown in color with its concomitant pollution. And in the same vein, it can be stated that the brown growth is in an organic autodestruct trajectory through rise in the scarcity value or the scarcity rent of the natural capital, resulting in commodity price rise and the increasing cost of pollution. So the question in front of all of us is degrowth the solution for the world? As such, proponents of both the schools, degrowth and green growth, they concur on one issue: the need and policy prescription for meeting conservation goals, environmental protection, maintenance of ecosystem structures, and development of renewables for reducing pollution. However, there are two issues in which they oppose each other. A, the issue of coexistence of the pursuance of growth with promoting conservation goals. B, the impact of ecological transition on economic growth. Now, the degrowth thesis talks of deceleration rather than growth in order to sustain the very fundamental basis of life that rests in nature. Now, let us come to the Indian imperatives in this context. We arrive at the very big question, whether a developing nation like India can afford to have a different set of objectives than growth. Now, many argue that degrowth is an Occidental or a Western construct. The EU Green Deal is more akin to degrowth. And so degrowth is a Western construct which can be adopted in spaces that have already grown and should not be applied to economies who have not really reached that stage. And in India, we already had the economic lockdown, which revealed the anguishes of the migrant labor, the micro and small enterprises, as also the poor. This implies that the social cushioning in the nation during times of distress was so far provided by the market forces and not by the governments. A situation which is tantamount to long-term policy failures, not of course short-term. So the failure of distribution and equity became extremely apparent. Now, can a system where social security has traditionally been a challenge at all opt for normative ethical principles of degrowth for the cause of nature? Therefore, the role of markets is undeniable as far as the Indian economy is concerned. Growth has been an organic, integral rider of the market forces that do not recognize the cause of nature, or that has not recognized the cause of ecosystems and sustainability. Let us now understand how we, suppose India is different from the EU system. One of the critical concerns for us is the loss in the ecosystem services due to, of course, on the one hand, anthropogenic pressures, on the other hand, the forces of global warming and climate change. Now, ecosystem services for the developing world, this was titled by the team, It was called GDP of the Poor. This appeared first time in a publication by Pawan Sukhdev in Nature in 2009. This is also because the livelihoods of the poor are dependent on them. And in some of the studies, in fact, conducted by me, I devised an index known as the ecosystem dependency ratio, or the ecosystem dependency index. This is the ratio of the sum of the values of the ecosystem services and the total income of the economy of the ecosystem under consideration. And in many of my studies, especially in the poorer regions of India, the Terra-Yark landscape or any of the protected, in and around the protected areas, I found that this ratio is more than one, more than unity. That means it's a very, the poor essentially earn more from the ecosystem than from the economic activities. So, and if you take the below poverty line population, this ecosystem dependency is even higher. So at the same time, what also needs to be noted is that large parts of the developing world, including India, might not have the wherewithal for mitigation and needs innovative modes of adaptation. This is also something that needs to be adopted in the Indian vision to combat the forces of global warming and climate change. Here, European Union can definitely plug in with technology when it comes to issues of mitigation, practices when it comes to adaptation, and of course the financial flows. Yet what I find on ground is that there is a clear resistance in adopting some of the global best practices. And this is mostly, in fact, at the level of the local community and the local governments. For example, in fact, we are facing a massive resistance among local governments in our advocacy for managed and strategic retreat for a community in the vulnerable regions of the Indian Sundarbans Delta or the archipelago are concerned, because we know that by certain projections state that by 2030 or by 2040, large parts of that portions of the archipelago might be under the sea. Similarly, the global best practice in combating water crisis and conflicts has now been sought also in trading in water derivatives, just as what is happening in the Chicago Mercantile Exchange. And I talked about this in a published paper in 2010. In fact, urged for getting into this kind of a mechanism or a financial instrument, but frankly speaking, takers were pretty less. Now, interestingly, much in contrary to the popular thinking that degrowth is a fashionable statement for those parts of the world that have already grown, it rather needs to be kept in mind that it is actually a statement emanating from a world that is more equitable, where social security is strong enough to act as a cushion during a crisis, where policies have been effected on distributive justice, and where reliance on market forces for meeting social needs is less. Now, so far, what we have witnessed as far as India's development vision is concerned, it has been more growth-oriented and much in the opposite direction. Distribution and equity problems loom large. So its environmental crisis cannot really be combated through a degrowth thinking as is being thought of in the context of the European Union. Rather, what India needs at this point in time is a holistic development paradigm that plugs in the ecosystem and distribution concerns in development. It needs a different configuration altogether in development thinking rather than the business as usual. That is reconciling the contending goals of economic efficiency, equity through distributive justice, and environmental sustainability through legal statutes as also economic instruments. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. Before I go to Alka, I'm going to quickly introduce you Dr. Uttam Kumar Sinha, who will follow Alka Hoekstra. Dr. Uttam Kumar Sinha is a fellow at the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis. And he's been a leading scholar and commentator on transboundary rivers, climate change, and the Arctic. He also has a very interesting book, which I have bought and I encourage you to get. It's the Indus Basin Interrupted, a history of territory and politics from Alexander to Nehru. So if you've not got it, really go out and buy it. I'm very eager to read it. He's also published a lot more, and he's sorry, yeah. Let me just quickly go to Auka and then Dr. Sinha, because they will speak about the sectoral challenges. Dr. Sinha will, of course, speak about agriculture and water issues. Agriculture is very interesting as a sector because it's one of the hardest to decarbonize. And India in particular, agriculture accounts for almost a fifth of Indian emissions, 74% of which is methane. It's actually the second largest of the power sector, but interestingly, it also employs around 60% of India's population, and most of it is subsistence. So let's go first to Auka and directly then to Dr. Sinha.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me? Yeah, good. Thank you, Gauri. I would like to thank the previous speakers, and I'm honored to be part of this August group. I especially like the presentation of Professor Dubash, who showed that we need to think about emission trajectories as something that has an angle, right? We need to bring that angle down to get to zero emissions. But to be honest, personally, I think requiring India to be carbon neutral in 2050, because Europe should be able to make it, is, I think, a little bit ignorant of the past and unfair and simplistic. At the same time, I would like to observe that most engineers think that growing wealth while reducing resource use is eminently possible, and that many economists think it's not. And a good example is transportation. I would like to talk about road transport because I know that very well, but also because it is a large and growing source of emissions. And I think that this is an area where it would actually overtake Europe simply because it has less legacy in terms of, let's say, old habits, infrastructure, and maybe most importantly, lobbyists. So I would like you to imagine it's 2030. Imagine you are looking at a new car in 2030. Imagine you walk into a showroom full of cars and you can choose between an electric and a combustion version of a similar car. Only the electric version is much faster, slightly cheaper to buy, and everybody knows it's much cheaper to own because they use 4 times less energy and require little maintenance. What do you choose in that showroom? Well, I research electric vehicles at Eindhoven University of Technology, and I grounded and lead a large program called NEON that looks into issues like this. And I also work with a lot of students and researchers from India, by the way, there. And I found that our answer to this highly probable scenario, everybody agrees on that, is somehow very different from the answer that most people give. And we are talking about massive greenhouse gas emissions here, so this really matters. The mainstream conclusion, inspired by, I think, car maker lobbyists and maybe car enthusiasts, assumes that most consumers will actually still want to buy that slow, polluting, and expensive combustion car in 2030. And I actually don't know why. I think that is old thinking. I think people will want to buy the electric car by then because it's more fun to drive, cheaper, and because a combustion engine will be a little bit like smoking. You know, not everybody has stopped yet, but everybody's thinking about it. So then the question is no longer how do we subsidize or force car makers to make electric vehicles? That question has become irrelevant. The question is, how do we facilitate swift adoption of this better technology, the electric vehicle? And I think if India and Europe will join forces on this, the possibilities are really endless. And I mean that. It's not just something I say because we're here in a forum like this. If we respect each other's strengths, we are highly complementary, and I think we can do great things together. And this is even more pressing for electric trucks. A lot of people think we're not able to decarbonize them quickly, but I've researched this more and longer than most, and I can tell you that battery electric trucks will almost certainly be much cheaper per ton kilometer in 2030. And we're simply not preparing for that yet. For example, we need a network of 2 megawatt fast chargers all over Europe and India, and somebody has to kickstart that in order to avoid chicken egg problems. Very interesting thing to take on as a government, for example. But most of all, we need to talk about batteries, because batteries are what set electric vehicles apart from combustion engines. And I know we should all use digital transportation, muscle-powered bikes, electric trains, and shared cars. Privately owned cars are indeed not the answer to livable cities. I agree. And India already has more vehicle sharing and then Europe. So in a way, they give the example. But personally, I'm convinced that, for example, if autonomous driving becomes a thing, and we encourage that, it could also be a thing in Europe, much faster shared cars. And I know you probably just turned to an oil lobbyist, turned hydrogen lobbyist who has told you that hydrogen is the answer to everything, also in the road sector. Maybe it will play a sizable role because refueling is indeed faster than charging, and hydrogen is indeed lighter than batteries. And I don't mind because it could be super low carbon emission, but also know that you need twice the amount of energy, the fuel is more voluminous, and that most scientists expect that hydrogen will always be a bit more expensive and more maintenance prone. So, still apart from the fact that battery electric vehicle market has been growing 1,000 times faster, there are tons of reasons why electric vehicles and batteries are the future, I think, or at least in a very important part of the future. So back to the battery. I think the most important thing both Europe and India can do to facilitate a rapid and sustainable transition to to electric vehicles is to expand battery production in a sustainable way. And this is also vital, by the way, to phase out coal, because solar plus wind plus batteries is basically the only way to really challenge coal at higher penetration rates. We could make battery production almost emission-free by running mines and factories on renewable energy. We know how to do this. As an engineer, I say it's trivial. I know politically it's really complicated and also sociologically. But we should expand mining at a much faster rate than we're currently doing. That's a really big challenge. And at the same time, we have to avoid doing it in areas of high biodiversity. We should employ sustainable technologies to do it. And we should, for example, reuse wastewater in the production of lithium, a good example of something that we could quite easily do if we demand it of producers. Last but not least, I think we should promote the use and measurement of life cycle analysis. I'm really torn about this because I can see the amount of red tape and the amount of procedures it could bring with it. So I really understand how a lot of my Indian friends think like, oh my God, if Europe is going through with this is going to create an endless hassle. But I think, unfortunately, that tracing where stuff comes from cannot be avoided forever. And I personally am a big fan of Yoda and other energy efficient distributed ledgers, basically variants of Bitcoin and blockchain that use less energy. And I think such fully transparent mechanism, devoid of any red tape, are the best way could be a good way to make battery production not using coal, not using slave labor, and no longer destroying natural habitats. So to conclude, I know for sure that electric mobility is the future. That's already very clear. I think the main question is how can we quickly scale up battery production, but in a way that avoids the errors Europe so clearly demonstrated during the previous industrial revolution. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Uttam, please. Dr. Sinha?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Gauri. Thank you for inviting me to the panel discussion. I hope you can all hear me.
Yes, perfectly. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Business School of Governance partnered in this event. I think learned a lot from the earlier sessions, and I'll pick up on two broad observations that I would like to make first. The first is that there's an enormous striking similarity of India and the EU, and that relates to both being unions of diversity. I think this is very important because there is a great deal of sharing value of democracy, preserving a rule-based international order, and sort of putting on track multilateralism. These are so essential and important for any climate convergence, any climate conversation, or climate dialogue. So I think both these two, EU and India, are in a sense extracting a lot of strategic values from their partnership, which is something quite remarkable over the last decade or so. One of the principal reasons, and I want to emphasize this, is that why India has a considerable coping capacity is that it has a democratic and a federalized political system. And I think it equally has a resilient civil society that provides, institutional capital, expertise, innovation, and in a certain way helps in coping and dealing with climate change. Let me also observe, before I come to the meat of my talk, that no sectoral reforms in a densely populated country like India can come about without global climate collaboration. I think I want to emphasize this. The global climate collaboration, which among many things means facilitating affordable access to green technologies and finance, but also importantly, dissuading certain countries from pressurizing others diplomatically or otherwise. So I think that is also very important to note. Let me quickly draw attention on two sectors which I think are quite interlinked and interconnected, food and water. I think it's important in our assessment of the Indian sectoral scenario is to constantly analyze the food and water nexus, particularly with the changing pattern that we have witnessed in the last several decades. It's important because it will help meet India's growing food and water demands in the very near time, I think. We all know that at the apex, there is a national action plan for climate change set up in 2008, which has two important missions. It has 8 missions, but 2 important missions here is the National Mission for Sustainable Agriculture. And I think the objective really is to transform agriculture into an ecologically sustainable, climate resilient production system. I think this is well outlined and well defined. And along with it is the water mission, which the objective is to conserve water, minimize wastage, and ensure equitable distribution, both across the sectors, within the states as well, through what it describes as an integrated water, resources, development, and management. So I think this is the broad structure of what India is looking at, how India feels confident about, and what India also requires the outside world to engage with. Looking at the agricultural sector, I think clearly it's the Achilles heel of India's economy and will face, by all accounts, the most severe destruction from climate change. The agricultural sector over the decades has already become hugely stressed. Various factors, labor intensive, inefficient, and the entire productive model that is becoming less viable. And climate change will only exacerbate this sector and will create difficulties in achieving economic stability in the future. I think linked to the agricultural sector, which we often tend to miss out on, is the internal mass migration that is going to happen in India. It's already happening, but that will increase furthermore with the impact on climate change on the agricultural sector. Various studies have clearly observed that the extreme and sudden climate shocks like flash floods and cyclones, along with the slow onset of climate change, like changing patterns of rainfall and droughts, will exacerbate mass internal migration from rural areas to cities and towns, putting enormous stress on the urban centers. I mean, studies also clearly indicate that as certain countries urbanize quickly, they will experience a greater degree and a number of climate migrants. I think behind all this economic hardship, which seems to be the obvious driver of mass movement of people from the rural to the urban, I think behind that economic hardship is the more silent impact of climate change on the falling agricultural income. And I think the decline in the economic importance of agriculture in India will directly affect the majority of India's population. And this is something that needs to be looked at and paid attention to. Broadly, if you look at India's population, 65% live in rural areas and about 41% of India's workforce is engaged in the agricultural sector. So this is a critical sector, a very important sector. But the trends over the last few decades clearly show that it's been declining, both in terms of the workforce and also in terms of people moving away into the urban sectors. There could be many reasons for this. I think poor public investment in the agricultural sector is probably one of them. Inadequate access to institutional credit also, is adding to the decline in the agricultural sector. But also, I think the frequent droughts and floods are equally contributing to this decline. I think this declining trend, both in terms of India's workforce and the economic returns from the agricultural sector, I think is quite critical and needs some attention, really. The recent economic survey of India clearly suggests that the agricultural share in the gross domestic product has almost reached 20%, which is good news because this has been the largest increase in the last 17 years. But if you look at historically, India's agricultural contribution to the GDP has almost been 30 to 35%. So compared to that, you can see there is a decline. I think this sudden increase in this GDP output, I think, is important because it takes care of our food security issues. The total food grain production in India has increased by 11 million tons than the previous year. So I think these are some good news that needs to be protected. There are various degrees of laws being introduced into the agricultural sectors. Some, of course, are politically charged, highly emotive, but the idea is really to bring in a degree of remedy through these laws, and rather than look at laws as a cause of malady. And I think overall, I think that India requires a great degree of paradigm shift in how it looks at its agriculture, moving away more from a rural livelihood sector to a more modern business enterprise. And that's where, in a sense, the policies are gravitating towards. The water sector, I think the water challenges are broadly four. Apart from the water being a dwindling resource and a challenge to the agricultural sector, it is also increasingly becoming highly polluted and life-threatening. 50% of the rural household rely on non-piped, unclean drinking water, and about 20% of the urban households use untreated drinking water. So all this drive towards having piped water does not necessarily mean safe water. So I think hygiene, health is an important part of the water challenges in India. And I think many of the Indian cities, and as studies show, do not really comply with safe drinking water standard. And this, I think, is a cause of worry, really. Also, the impact of climate change resulting in floods and droughts, and the issue of water governance, particularly between center and the states, are some of the other water challenges that will emerge in the near future. I think if you have to calculate land and water into India's economic growth, the rough calculations suggest that India needs to generate 4 times more GDP to achieve probably a GDP growth rate of 10% in the agricultural sector. And along with it, India needs to generate in the irrigation sector almost 5 times more water to produce that kind of GDP in the future. So I think the targets and the ambitions are there, but I think India needs to also bolster its agricultural sector and the water sector. And it has to look at it in a much more integrated manner, which brings me back to the water-food nexus. Agriculture in India uses about 78% of India's freshwater resources. And as India develops, the share of water between the domestic sector, the industrial sector, and the agricultural sector will rise. There'll be tensions between these sectors. It is not so much about water scarcity, I think, as much as it is about water users and the users. And I think that needs a considerable degree of balancing act when you start framing larger holistic policies. I think there'll be a lot of pressure on the agricultural sector in terms of introducing new methods, thinking about new science and new technologies, which are easy and usable, so that you can derive more crop per drop. I mean, that's the whole theme running in the agricultural sector, more water efficient means of production, really. Also to increase the land productivity, I think that's going to be a major important task in our future development path. It has to be measured increasingly more as tons per hectare, the land productivity. So as you increase the land productivity, you also need to maximize your irrigation productivity as well. So irrigation and land productivity will be an important part of India's developmental future. I think one of the biggest worry when you're utilizing water in India is the exploitation of groundwater. I think that is something that we've realized over the years that the groundwater level is quite alarming. This has come about because policies of free and highly subsidized power, particularly in those green revolution belt of Punjab and Rajasthan and Haryana, has actually led to this very dreadful situation. In fact, if you do, studies have come out to suggest that 1/3 of India's overall districts, and there are about 718 districts in India, have been witnessing over-exploitation of groundwater resources. So I think the time has really come, in some sense, to think about policies that moves away from a highly subsidized pricing of water, power, and even fertilizers, to a more direct income support on a per hectare basis, and a greater degree of investment policies that help with newer technologies and innovation. I think this is not an easy path because it is politically very charged. There's a political cost when you talk about doing away with subsidies in India. But I think there is a conversation now. There is much more easiness in the policy circle now to talk about moving away from this heavy burden subsidized pricing of water and power in particular. I think one needs to understand this pricing of water and power as per their economic value rather than just political appeasement here. Therefore, I think keeping these two sectors, critical sectors in mind, the India-EU strategic partnership, which last year met and set a roadmap of 2025 is particularly interesting. I think the target of 2025 rather than 2040, 2050 is much more feasible and practical and rational. I think focusing on climate change and clean energy and environment has been the emphasis of the last partnership. And I think it's important to promote such kind of cooperation, strengthening the sustainable food systems between EU and India. I think there's been a lot of traction on India and EU in the water cooperation front. I think they already have a joint working group on water, and there is a EU-India Water Forum as well as an India-EU Water Partnership. So while there's a great deal of traction on the water sector, I think the food system and cooperation on that should also be pushed up the ladder in the coming times. I think both food and water are bringing the two geographies of Europe and India closer in understanding priority areas. There's no doubt about that. These areas are quite existential. I think the best way forward here is collaboration, coordination, joint actions, which seems to be the drivers for convergences that are quite required. And I think if one has to look at a framework, one can build on the framework of what can be described as policies that are transformative, that is strengthening civilian institutions, policies that between the two EU and India that are far more integrative, which means obviously taking a multidisciplinary approach and utilizing a wider stakeholder into the integrative approach. And also policies that are preventive in nature, which essentially addresses the cause and not just the symptoms. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both speakers. Uttam, you've provided such an interesting insight into vast challenges. It's quite sobering to hear such figures and perceptions from India, especially when the whole debate here is about decarbonization and ensuring everybody reaches jumps onto the race for net zero. But we need reminding, of course, that India has to feed 1.4 billion people, provide safe drinking water as well. So it has its own challenges. And these need to be taken in mind. And of course, this opens a lot of scope for cooperation. As you mentioned, we need more focus on transformative change making and more stakeholder involvement. Let's move on to our next two speakers, again focusing on the sectoral debate, which I'm finding quite interesting to really take a deep dive. First, we go to Dr. Sebastian Oberthur. He's my colleague and the director of our research center. He's also a research professor at the BSoG. Sebastian has worked quite a bit on international climate governance, and he's very interesting a body of work on how the Paris Climate Agreement could be enhanced as well. And we've worked together on this. We've looked at also what kind of governance the Paris Climate Agreement would need to ensure that everyone, not only the developed economies, but also the developing economies could benefit from in moving towards a low carbon future. And then following him would be Dr. Vaibhav Chaturvedi, who is a fellow at CEW and leads the council's work on low carbon pathways. He's also the co-chair of Mitigation Working Group of Independent Global Stocktake Process, an international civil society initiative, and the review editor of IPCC's 6th Assessment Report, Chapter 3, along with being a member of various Government of India committees related to energy and climate change. He, along with Dr. Ghosh, Arunabha Ghosh, have been shaping the Indian perspective on net zero debate recently through their, and a long time ago, through their research and popular articles in a lot of leading dailies. If you've not checked out their work, really do. I've quoted some on Twitter. So first, Dr. Oberthur, and then to Dr. Chaturvedi.
Thanks, Gauri. Thanks very much for having me. I understand I should focus my intervention on the industry and power sectors. And I'll try to structure my brief remarks in 3 points. And the first will be about carbon pricing and the EU ETS. So I'll actually focus on the EU policy framework for these 2 sectors. And we can see then what this may hold in terms of lessons for India or broader decarbonization in these sectors. So the EU ETS was already mentioned, and we have had it since 2005, obviously. And perhaps what's important to understand is that there is not just an ETS and then it's there and then it works, but it has been undergoing important reforms over the years. When we reflect back, there has been introduction of much more auctioning rather than grandfathering and free allocation of emission allowances. There has obviously also been the introduction of a market stability reserve in the 2010s to address an oversupply in the market. There obviously over time also with the increasing the strengthening of the EU's greenhouse gas emission reduction targets, the reduction factor, the linear reduction factor in the ETS has also been increased. There is already, with the increased introduction of auctioning, there was at the same time also then the introduction of certain funds over the years that could be used to then actually support the decarbonization efforts in these sectors. And that is already bringing me to my second point. And that is that actually this whole policy for the power and industry sectors is more of a policy mix than just carbon pricing. So the ETS has frequently been called the flagship of EU climate policy. I think it's true that it is the flagship for the industry and power sectors, not necessarily for the other sectors. But it's surrounded by a whole flotilla, or perhaps even an armada, I'm not sure, of policy instruments. And I think what we have increasingly realized is that carbon pricing is not sufficient, but it needs to be part of a broader mix. that addresses actually the barriers that are not only related to prices. So I already mentioned the funds. So funds to support the rollout of new zero emission technologies, also referred to as breakthrough technologies, have been very important, because at some point you're hitting a point, especially in the energy intensives, where just increasing the price will not make actors shift to new technologies, but you need to actually incentivize them. So this has then, and we have already, I don't need to go into the CBAM, which we discussed earlier, which is part of the emerging mix of thoughts, at least, of what could be done. I'm not 100% sure that CBAM will eventually come and in what form it may appear. But I mean, we have increasing also thinking about demand pull measures, so contracts for difference, public procurement that would incentivize a market for low carbon or zero emission steel, etc. We have the promotion of renewable energy, which is particularly important for the power sector, with the EU's Renewable Energy Directive that is also currently being revised in the and there will be a new proposal as part of the Fit for 55 package that Anna, I think, already mentioned. There are state aid guidelines that then also govern how support could be given to these industries. There is the hydrogen initiative that will play a role, to what extent low carbon, zero carbon hydrogen will become available for these industries, and will either be in the power sector, be available as a backup option, or be, especially in the steel industry, but also in the chemical industry, be available eventually. And this will all not necessarily appear through the carbon market, but these are specific targeted initiatives. And let's not forget, for the power sector, that there is a whole host of regulations for the electricity market. These are not markets that just are out there and operate by themselves, but they are regulated to a big extent. We have grid development, we have the rules that apply for the feed-in of renewable energy into the grid, etc. Many elements. We have obviously, as part of the overall mixture, also the COVID-19 recovery funds that may also have an impact in these sectors, and that decarbonization may actually be accelerated in them. And we have rules that have been developed in the EU guiding finance and investment. And obviously these rules will also have a big impact on investors in the power and industry sectors. An industrial strategy, and we already discussed the Just Transition mechanism, the Just Transition Fund, that obviously also has a big effect. So this is just to say, I'm not sure I have exhausted the field, but there is a whole policy mix, a whole host of policies that actually need to be taken into account when we look at the industry and power sectors. And I guess that holds important lessons also for other actors. And what I see in the public debate is always that we focus a lot on carbon pricing, but I think we underestimate that it needs to be embedded in a far broader mix. Brings me to the third point, and I assume I can be short on this one, because if you want to understand the EU and the EU system, you also need to look, and I think Anna also already hinted at that, at the member states. It's the EU level, sure, but then a lot of the action actually comes also at the member state level. It's a mixed competence game. Some of it is decided at the EU level, some of it is decided at the member state level, and a lot of the implementation is at the member state level. This, for example, relates to state aid. Eventually, whether state aid is given, whether the resources are available for that, that is at the member state level. So we have seen yesterday news that Germany might have a system of contracts for difference for steel. for zero emission steel. This is at the member state level. All the plans for phasing out coal are at the member state level. Obviously, that might be driven also by the ETS, but how to design the coal phase out, how to time it, how to make it a just transition in the regions affected, that's a member state competence. So eventually, there's a lot of flexibility, and also on the positive side, the opportunity to adapt to local conditions and to national conditions when we go to the member state level and look at how they then implement the European schemes. I think, well, we were encouraged, I think, to be brief. I hope that was brief enough. ETS, policy mix, member states, these were the messages. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Sebastian. Vaibhav, please. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Gauri. Thank you for the Brussels School of Governance for inviting me. I also thank all the speakers before me. I think that it has been a very rich discussion. I've learned a lot. I'm the last speaker, so let me just go ahead. I will be talking about perspectives on peaking and net zero for India's energy sector, CO2 emissions. I'll be talking about different sectors, not just one sector, but what does it mean for challenges across sectors. And a lot of it is based on what me and Arnaba have thought about and written in the last couple of months on this particular topic. Net zero is an economy-wide debate, but it sort of incorporates the many sectors transition. It could be power sector, it could be renewable energy, industrial sectors, and within CW we try to sort of inform the net zero debate by looking at all the different aspects, sectoral aspects, as well as the economy-wide aspects of the net zero transition. So the first point I want to make is that there is a debate on short term versus not long term, and we think that the short term targets are not alternatives to long term targets. It's sort of a false binary, and both of these are sort of complementary and they go together very well. And if we have a very sort of a certain sense of the long term, net zero gives some sort of long term certainty, which is always good. So if we get that kind of certainty, and the short term action should actually guide us towards that long term target, and that's why these are complementary and these have to go together. The second point is the debate has been confounded by this thing on net zero by 2050 versus net zero in itself. And I think a lot of us ended up focusing on net zero by 2050 just because there was a lot of pressure coming on India to say something till 2050. Now that sort of lost the core issue. The core issue is not at all by 2050. The core issue, I think what speakers before me have also talked about, the core issue is about net zero, whether we should think about net zero or not, and what are the challenges for India across sectors in thinking about sort of a net zero future. The peaking and net zero have to go together for a growing economy. And that's an important point to be made for all the other economies, many other economies that are already either stabilizing or already on the declining path. They don't really need to worry about peaking. Peaking is going to happen very soon. But for a very fast growing economy or a fast growing economy, peaking has to happen, and only then the sort of curve shifts and starts going towards net zero. And I will talk about what is the big challenge, in peaking, and why does peaking implicitly figure into the net zero discussions, at least for India, right? Now, one big perspective is about equity and climate justice, and it cannot be ignored. And this particular graph, it shows the cumulative CO2 emissions. We are interested in the net zero debate only to ensure the future cumulative emissions for all the big and small emitters, they don't end up taking us beyond at this well below 2 degrees kind of target. And the red part of the bar, it shows the future emissions, and the historical emissions are the blue part of these different bars. And you could see different scenarios for India. The most ambitious 2030 peak and 2050 net zero, and the least ambitious the 2050 peak and 2090 net zero. And you could see future emissions across all of these. And one thing I want to highlight is what sort of jumps out from this comparative graph is that there is nothing to be celebrated about China's net zero pledge. Now you could just see the impact of China's cumulative emission, and this already incorporates the 2030 peak and a 2060 net zero. So these are numbers coming out after incorporating China's pledge, and you could just see the humongous impact, not just in terms of total, but in terms of the future impact that Chinese emissions are going to going to create. We need to ask all these historical polluters to also advance their net zero years. There's nothing very ambitious about 2050 EU or 2050 US net zero and a 2060 net zero for China. Ideally, they should sort of advance their net zero years to the extent possible. Also, India should harness opportunities and try to create possibilities that it is able to achieve net zero sort of as early as possible, whatever is feasible, but as early as possible. And that's what we need to better understand to minimize our future climate impacts. So a big point, what needs to be thought about is the feasibility of transition. So net zero is important, but by when we could achieve net zero is what needs to be understood. And there are very many different aspects of the feasibility of this transition. So the first aspect is the gap between the peaking and net zero year and the resources available to support the transition. And what is meant by the gap between peaking and net zero year? Now, if you look at all the other economies and the numbers, the years given here are the peaking year for different economies, and the blue circle shows the per capita emissions in the peaking year, and the orange circle is the per capita income in the peaking year for the different economies, right? So per capita income gives some sort of crude sense of resources available for a country to facilitate the transition, because resources would be required, as highlighted earlier by many speakers. So transition cannot happen in 10 years. As Professor Garg also mentioned, we can't simply peak in 2040 and go to net zero in 2050, right? So there is system-wide economic transition across sectors. They do need some decades to happen. All the other countries have a lot many decades. India would also need to think about this sort of feasibility of the transition in terms of the gap between peaking and net zero years, along with the per capita income. If you start immediate transition, the per capita incomes are much lower to support the transition. The more you go further, well, you have got more resources available for this transition to happen. So these are important elements. The second very important element is the impact of GDP growth. So GDP growth is actually a very important element which helps us understanding the angle of that transition that is required for India. And this graph shows that these are three elements which are known in the Kaya identity: GDP growth rate, primary energy intensity of GDP change rate, and emission intensity of primary energy. So the GDP growth rate is the orange bar, and this is India. This is what the long-term modeling, the kind of work that we do, tells us. And the core insight from this slide is that till the time GDP continues to increase at a rate higher than the sum of decline in the other two elements, which is primary energy intensity of GDP and carbon intensity or emission intensity of primary energy, the carbon dioxide emissions actually don't peak. This is the arithmetic behind it. And that's why we are saying the role of GDP is so powerful. Now, as per our analysis, the exact peak happens somewhere around 2070. But you see, India's emissions already start kind of tapering by 2060. And as Professor Garg said, it could also we could advance this peak by maybe 15-20 years if there are some big developments in some of the sectors which as of now technologies are not there. For example, the freight sector. So it could be advanced, but assuming that peaking happening in 2030, you see the ultimately the two bars here, the blue and the gray bars, have to add up to be higher than this orange bar. And that's why peaking is such a challenging thing for a fast growing economy. The role of GDP growth is very important. Now just a quick snapshot of China, what is happening with China, and these are also through global modeling efforts that we do. Chinese economy is already expected to peak around 2040. This is a Chinese curve, and you could see it is already tapering in 2030 because it's on back of almost 30 years of very high growth rates. The growth rates are tapering. So this sort of GDP growth effect is not there for China, especially post 2030. So it's much more easier for it to peak and then decline its emissions. And this is definitely not the case with China. So GDP growth rate becomes a very important element in understanding the feasibility of transition. Now, in terms of the cross-sectoral view, what is going to be the state of different sectors, or what is required to be done in different scenarios? We have explored many different scenarios. Here I'm just presenting, this is what is historical number in the blue, dark blue. The gray bar is a 2050 number for a 2070 net zero scenario, and the orange bar is the 2050 number in the 2050 net zero scenario. So all these are for 2050. You look at the share of non-hydro renewable energy in electricity generation. For whenever we want to achieve net zero, whenever India wants to achieve net zero, be it 2030 or be it 2050, the share of non-hydro renewable energy, if CCS is not successful, as of now it is not successful. So if it is not sort of successful in terms of economics, then the share has to go to 84%. And the size of the electricity system also will be much bigger, because electrification of end use sectors, both industrial and freight, as well as passenger transport, is also going to be a very big element. So we are talking about a much larger electricity sector, and an 80% share of solar and wind in that much larger electricity sector. So the question for feasibility is always that whether it is possible to do in the next 30 years, or whether it's possible to do in the next 40, 50 years. That is the call that, you know, policymakers and stakeholders, decision makers in India, actors on the ground have to take. And that's why it does appear that going from a 10% to a 80% number in a much larger electricity system in a span of 30 years does appear to be very, very challenging. You know, and that's what the line ministries we are engaging with, Ministry of, you know, Power, Ministry of New Renewable Energy. This is what, you know, this is what is there in their mind. You know, is it doable? That is exactly the question of feasibility. The share of electricity industrial energy use has to grow very fast. Right now it's 20%, because of the cross subsidy in the Indian policy. Electricity is very expensive, coal is very cheap. There is no reason industrial guys have to go for electricity unless it's extremely, you know, what do you say, it's technically that's the only option. So electricity is important, electricity share, and some massive policy reforms will have to sort of facilitate this. In absence of those, this is not possible. Similarly, share of freight in electric trucks, right now it's almost 0%. It has to grow to almost 70% in net zero kind of scenario. And this technology is not available. The share of fossil in primary energy, right now it's 75%. It has to grow go to less than 5%. Whenever the net zero year is 2050 or 2070, you know, whenever that happens, it has to grow. And this is netted by maybe some part in afforestation and all. But this is what is the reality of the sectoral transformation. The question for, you know, Indian actors and policymakers are only how much of that, I mean, what is the time path in which this is possible? You know, what is the ask? And that is what we are trying to understand, and helping, you know, many industry, many stakeholders in India, including ministries, to better understand. Ultimately, India will have to face economic trade-offs sooner or later. You know, I mean, I'll just flip over it. There are many kinds of economic trade-offs. Some colleagues of mine have already talked about coal workers, coal families, what happened to public sector undertakings, coal dependent states, not just in terms of employment, but their own fiscal resources. Then there is a question of power pricing reforms, Indian railways, and many sort of economic trade-offs are staring at India. The question is always, when will India as a country be in a situation to address these? Will the next 10 years suffice? Will we, or it could only happen after 30 years, when India is a much more richer nation in terms of per capita income. So just to conclude, the net zero announcement matters, but implications need to be understood. And I think the government of India and many stakeholders are already in the process of understanding the implications. It does not mean that something will be announced by Glasgow, because probably 6 months is too little. And the priorities right now are definitely pandemic. But this process is underway to understand that what it takes. And ultimately, only after understanding and being confident about it, because we are a fast growing economy, only then a decision can be taken. You know, and that process is, it's very good thing that the process is underway. So short term and long term targets are not alternatives. These are complementary to each other. Equity and climate justice cannot be ignored. And all the big polluters should ideally, you know, prepone their net zero years, especially China. Its climate impact is humongous. The feasibility of transition matters. There are many different elements. It could be GDP growth rate, per capita income, gap between peaking and net zero years, pace of transition, economic trade-offs, cost of mitigation technology issue. That's extremely important. I don't think there is any principal opposition to net zero if cost of mitigation technologies across sectors is anyways competitive. Then it makes business sense. You know, the reality is it is not the case, and it's only that during time these will be discovered, and that is an element that needs to be considered during thinking about the feasibility of transition. And that's why looking at alternative scenarios and trade-offs is extremely important. It's not just about one scenario. Looking at all the alternative scenarios, their trade-offs, and what is actually feasible and doable is how the decision is kind of being approached within India. Ultimately, it's about solution space. Both Dr. Arnaba Ghosh and Dr. Garg have talked about low-cost finance. It is extremely important part of the solution space. Similarly, technology co-development. So these are elements of the solution space. And narratives are important, but ultimately it's solutions that will move us towards both short-term actions as well as, you know, long-term target. So solution space is critical, and that's what we need to kind of think about. So I think, thank you. That's where I will end. Happy to answer, you know, any questions. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Vaibhav and Sebastian. I won't say anything for now. Let me just go directly to the participants and go to René Klaus. You may ask your question. Please introduce yourself and and direct a question to one of our panelists.
Thank you very much, and hello everyone. My name is René Klaus. I'm a master's student in international politics at the University Ghent, Belgium, and I'm doing my master thesis on the EU-India climate cooperation. So this event is very interesting for my own research. So I want to thank everyone, and especially for your presentations. For my question, I sincerely hope that there are still some panel members present who can answer my question. Because as both ambassadors already said, the India and the EU partnership is experiencing a momentum on climate change. But during the trade negotiations a few years ago, there was also a mention of a momentum or a goodwill, but these negotiations evolved according to many researchers in a deadlock. So that's why I'm wondering how both India and the EU will ensure that this momentum on climate change cooperation won't weaken and won't be harmed by other dimensions of this strategic partnership. Thank you very much.
Who would like to take that? Anyone would like to take the question? Yeah, Dr. Aruna Baghosh, please.
I just didn't know, Gauri, if you wanted only the panelists in this session to come in. That's why I wanted to.
Yeah, okay.
I've been listening to all the presentations with interest. To René's question, I think, look, it's very simple. In any kind of strategic partnership, there are always grand bargains, right? And there'll be an element of trade, there'll be an element of finance, there'll be an element of security cooperation, there'll be an element of cooperation in global governance platforms, and there'll be an element of cooperation in climate change and energy. And there'll be gives and takes. And and the whole point about a grand bargain is that if you don't get everything you want in one domain, you could get more in another domain. So that's basic principle of establishing strategic partnerships. But let's just focus on the issues that we've been discussing now for 3 hours. At the core of everything that we are discussing is actually not the issue of which sector will grow faster or slower, or who can eliminate coal and who can build renewables faster. At the core of it is prospects for development. And India could argue that, and the EU could argue that. EU industries could say for development if there is, in principle, carbon leakage. And India could argue, what is my prospect for development if my electricity becomes more expensive or storage is not available? And I would urge that as academics or as advisors to policymakers or as policymakers, this is what we should be focusing ourselves on. We should be asking, what is the nature of climate policy or energy policy that helps our respective economies become more resilient and more competitive? There was a statement that I think Susanna made in the last session, where she used this term, and I noted it down, is, can we make sure that the competitive race becomes a collaborative one? And it struck me because I wondered, which competitive race is collaborative? Beyond sounding good, which competitive race is collaborative? We are still struggling with a situation where 20 years after the agreement on TRIPS and public health was determined, we're still wondering why we should or should not use compulsory licensing in response to a pandemic emergency, right? So then I come and think about issues like low carbon transition, and let's take something like green hydrogen. And I think about where the technologies are developing and where the technologies could be deployed. The technology is developing, say, in Germany or in Sweden. Where is going to be the demand for hydrogen coming from? Asia. And I've been plotting the number of bilateral relationships on hydrogen that have come up. And by my count, there are about a dozen, or about between 12 and 16, and maybe more in the offing. There's only one Asian country involved in a subset of them, and that is Japan. And that's obvious because it is invested in hydrogen for a long time. So my question then is, if the demand for hydrogen, green or otherwise, is going to come from Asia, the development of the technology is happening in Europe. Are we going to make this competitive, or are you going to make this collaborative? If we're going to make this collaborative, then you need to have genuine technology partnerships. And what is a genuine technology partnership? It is not a talk shop. It is actually willing to invest money in a third country or in a different geography to set up the pilot sites at scale, so you see how the technology is evolving. Otherwise, the motivation behind green or brown remains about competition and competitiveness rather than about collaboration. So I would urge, I mean, Weber and I have written extensively about the need to set long-term targets, about the need to have short-term policy direction to establish credibility. We've pushed extensively about ramping up India's renewable energy, electric vehicles, industrial decarbonization. But at the end of the day, just look at the arithmetic, and the arithmetic will not work if we don't establish genuine platforms for collaboration. If we keep raising trade barriers, if we keep talking about, restricting intellectual property, if we keep thinking about this is going to be my competitive currency for the green economy of the future, notwithstanding what the other Dr. Ghosh was mentioning, that the green economy itself is a bit of a misnomer. We have to then ask, what are the measures of collaboration? What are the metrics of success? If we don't have that, unfortunately, we will keep falling into mercantilist traps. And it's that mercantilist trap that will stop us from ramping up the action that we need. Between Copenhagen and Paris, 12% of WTO disputes, new WTO disputes, were around clean energy. Clean energy does not account for 12% of global trade. So what was the EU doing and Canada doing and US doing by raising tariff barriers and non-tariff barriers around trade in solar? Establishing competitive mercantilist markers. So we have to be serious about a low carbon transition. We have to be serious about what collaboration means. We have to be serious about accelerated and enhanced ambition. We have to be serious about accelerated and enhanced finance. Otherwise, the arithmetic simply does not add up.
Sebastian, you want to jump in?
Yeah, a lot has been said already, but perhaps a few points. I think what I hope can emerge is cooperation between where there's a lot of scope, I think, for learning from each other, but also, as was hinted at, I think, for providing support by the EU to India. But there was also hinted at, I think we are in geopolitics here. The conditions for EU-India cooperation, I think, have enhanced, given that China is out there and that both these actors may be looking at each other as cooperating also against that backdrop. Then obviously when it comes to investments, there will be competition because the EU will also look to Africa, etc. So one needs to see what's available. And there's COVID-19 obviously and the crisis. So I don't know whether high expectations could be fulfilled with respect to investment possibilities, etc. But I hope something can be developed. If you look at where the EU is with respect to its own decarbonization path and equity indicators, etc., and calls for the EU even to go quicker in its own decarbonization, I think we are at some point hitting a certain wall where one cannot change that quickly. But what that means in terms of equity is, I think, that the EU needs to do, not only the EU, but developed countries overall, needs to do more abroad, needs to help more others. Whether that is only India, I don't know, but it may fall into that basket also. So some of the responsibility, some of the capabilities of the EU will have to come to bear abroad. So I don't know exactly. And the one thing that I, from my experience of EU-Indian relations, that I don't know that much is the kind of, there's a lot of historical baggage and sensitivities whenever it comes to cooperation, where there is always, I think, a potential feeling that the other side wants to dominate or something like that. And I think that's the big challenge, to avoid that. And perhaps the broader geopolitics will help in that. And I think the potentially also increasing self-confidence of India over the past years, I think, to that they know that there are strongly emerging economy and power in the world. So I couldn't, tell you that it will work, but I think the chances are actually this time around perhaps not that bad. Thanks.
Dr. Ghosh has Nilanjan Ghosh has an immediate follow-up, I think.
Yeah. This is primarily related to see the kind of the first and foremost thing, in fact, I would like to see in terms of the cooperation is the knowledge transfer. Now, of course, see, the entire European model should not be imitated as it is, but the fact remains that we have to see the Indian context. There are some very, very important institutions and institutional mechanisms, as also instruments, which need to be learned from the European Union, whether it's in the context of how essentially they have looked at the institutions of river basin organization, whether it's from the perspective of pollution, or from the perspective of looking at the net zero economies and the economic instruments that are in vogue out there. Uttam, of course, talked of water governance to a large extent. In fact, see, certain economic instruments can work in here. In large, most of the cases, what has happened is that extensive water use has happened in this part of the world precisely because of one pricing phenomenon, that is the minimum support prices. Between 1980 and between 2015, the minimum support price of the water consuming crops like paddy and wheat were increasing at a very much faster rate than suppose say the drier alternatives like the sorghum or even the millets. So eventually that completely changed the terms of trade. On the other hand, in fact, the incentives that has been talked of in the context of the Green Deal, that is better soil management practices, as also in fact in the context of soil carbon and incentivizing the farmers for better soil management practices. These are some important instruments, but these need to be learned properly and then in fact, I would say internalized and customized as per the Indian framework. Now, which institution is going to do that? That is also a critical question in here. So suppose say the Commission of Agricultural Costs and Prices, they are looking at the minimum support price regime. Now, lately they recognize that their pricing regime has led to extensive usage of, or rather acreage movement towards more water consuming crops like paddy and wheat from the, or even sugarcane. So what happened was, in fact, especially for the irrigated paddy, they decreased the price, the minimum support prices of rice, and increased the minimum support price of the drier alternative, especially the small millets. So it's not that these things are working instantaneously. They take time. In fact, agriculture has its own cycle, 3-year or 5-year cycle, by way of which you can feel the impacts. So now, on the other hand, when it comes to the better soil management practices, which institution is going to incentivize for that? So these are certain things that we need to think of when it comes to India, because there are examples existing in the European Union by way of which they have done this. But at the same time, the entire socio-political setting, which I talked of, that most of these are emerging from a world that is much more equitable. The entire degrowth hypothesis or the European Green Deal is emerging for a world that is much more equitable. This is not an equitable world that we are residing in. We still have our ambitions. We still have a much more inequitous forms of distribution systems. So how do we essentially internalize and customize these instruments needs to be thought of, and the right kind of institutional mechanisms also need to be thought of as far as India is concerned.
Okay, thank you. I will quickly give the floor to Anna, who had a couple of questions. Please keep it short, and then I will close.
Well, no, I didn't have any questions specifically. I mean, I just wanted to quickly perhaps make a short remark. But I mean, if anyone had other questions or something, I think we can either leave it or.
No, please go ahead.
Right. No, I just wanted to address quickly the issue of targets and pledges, because I think it's something that has come like very recurrently. And for instance, I found very interesting Dr. Dubash's remarks earlier about not necessarily hard pledges are not necessarily needed. Targets do not necessarily lead to actions. And I mean, when we look at the EU context, I mean, the net zero 2050 target didn't come out of nothing, and that come as a result of a process of extensive consultations, 100 pages impact assessment. That same happened with the updated 2030 target. And I mean, I think it really puts the emphasis on knowing where we want to go, so we know the tools of how we get there. For instance, I mean, also in terms of the 2030 target, a lot's been talking about the need for carbon sinks, absorbing emissions, and even, for instance, as a result of the climate law that had been negotiated in the past few months, the EU has set as a kind of an aspirational goal, if you want to call it. I mean, not a hard target, but a kind of an aspiration to even try to strive for negative emissions after 2050. And I think that's going to spur a very important conversation at EU level on how do we foster carbon removal technologies and also like natural carbon sinks. I mean, in the next couple of years, we're going to see very important initiatives coming up on incentivizing farmers, incentivizing foresters to capture emissions. So I think in a sense, really knowing where do we want to get and really having this kind of very extensive and EU-wide consultations and conversations about where we want to go, it can really be a catalyst of many of the solutions needed in this long term. That's all.
Indeed, interesting points. We need to know where we want to go. I will allow final opportunity for the participants if there's any questions. Please raise your hand. Otherwise, I see Weber, if you wanted to come in. In the meantime, if there's any participants who want to ask a question or make a comment, just raise your hand. I will come back to you. Weber, please.
Yes, thank you, Gauri. I just want to kind of second what Anna has said, you know, that essentially in India also, the way we are thinking about is about a process, right? Stakeholder process, intensive stakeholder process backed by analysis. It cannot be just dialogue on the basis of perspectives. It has to be backed by this analysis, which EU has done, right? I think what Dr. Nilanjan Ghosh was also talking about, there are many things for us to learn from India. And this is one of the things, right? So it always has been a stakeholder process. The difference has to be that, you see, the net zero is a specific formulation of deep decarbonization, right? Deep decarbonization as a debate has been there for very long, but deep decarbonization is sort of is comforting. And it is fuzzy. It's comforting because it's fuzzy, because everybody can draw whatever they want to from the deep decarbonization that debate. So I could say that India's emission intensity is declining at a very fast pace. So that is deep decarbonization. Even though in reality emissions are kind of increasing, right? So what the net zero does, it puts us in a pretty uncomfortable situation. That's what it does, because there's nothing fuzzy about net zero. Like deep decarbonization, it is actually a very hard target, and which makes us uncomfortable, but it also sort of galvanizes action. It forces us to think about, okay, what are the alternatives for net zero years, but what are the tools that we need to get there. And I think many of the earlier speakers have also talked about this solution, as I said, that these are the tools that will be needed, but what is going to be the magnitude of the tools will only be determined by whether 2070 is a net zero, or 2080 is a net zero, or 2050 is a net zero for you. It's always the pace that is going to be determined by the solutions. Probably in the character would be still similar, right? So I think that's why I completely agree with what Anna has said, a stakeholder driven process, which has been galvanized by the net zero debate in the way probably which the deep decarbonization debate was not able to galvanize in India, right? So which is a very good thing. But ultimately, yes, this process will take some time. Because analysis will take some time. All the stakeholders will ultimately have to say yes. The Ministry of Power and Ministry of Renewable Energy and Ministry of Coal in India have to say yes, I'm comfortable I'm comfortable achieving net zero in my sector by 2070 or whatever year. And that is what stakeholder discussions are all about. All the manufacturing industry guys will need to say that in my industry, I will be able to achieve net zero by this year. And only after all that consensus, which will take time, this net zero will sort of emerge. So yes, it's a very important and interesting discussion. And yes, I think I will conclude here. Thank you.
Dr. Garg as well wanted to speak. Dr. Garg, please go ahead.
You're on mute.
Yeah. So just one point, role of businesses and industry is extremely important. Somehow today we have been talking from policymakers' perspective, but also touched upon briefly. I would say that unless we bring industry strong way, so in a way, I don't know whether it is a question. I would like to know whether from EU friends, when are you going to open EU ETS to Indian industry? Or you are not going to open, because then we have to start de novo, create our own markets. That will take 10 to 12 years. So I think we must think about global collaboration. And this is very simple. Some limits can be established, some targets can be set, and we can get going. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, we do have one. Renee, please.
Thank you very much. For my last question, I was wondering, and it's a kind of broad question for everybody, what you wanted to see or what the outcome should be of the summit this weekend on climate change, and maybe not really focus on energy, because I'm convinced that there will be talked about this, but more on the overall climate change. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Garg, you wanted to speak?
Maybe positive collaborative discussion is the best outcome we can get. We cannot, at least I don't think of any hard results. Keep on discussing, and that itself is we are moving together. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I will have to conclude. Normally I've been very strict, but this has been such an interesting debate. 3.5 hours straight, and I've really enjoyed every bit of it. I won't go and resume everyone, but I have two interesting quotes from Dr. Niranjan Ghosh, who said, you need to customize for Indian framework. And Auka, who said, if we respect each other's strengths, we're highly complementary, and they're both true. There's a lot going on in EU-India relations, there's a plethora of meetings, working groups, initiatives, the two platforms that are there. I think the way forward is, of course, building on these more concrete deliverables, more concrete initiatives. But most importantly, really is to understand each other, and we need to talk to each other more. Just like today, I've learned so much. And it really helps much more beyond just reading online, on Twitter, on news. It's really to talk to each other. And I think this is the key going forward, especially in terms of the climate transition. And India and the EU are both committed in their own ways. There is no need for helicoptering in with policy blueprints, which won't be fitted for an Indian context, or vice versa. But to appreciate each other's challenges, and also the huge body of achievements that India has made, which thanks to our panelists, we've got to know about. I hope that the summit takes into account all of this, and personally, I would like to take this forward and have more such debate with such excellent participants on both sides to really chart a few recommendations to the EU-India strategic partnership, because more understanding is really going to help make the EU-India partnership on climate action have more impact. So from the bottom of my heart, I thank you all, especially to all the Indian participants who, there's a lot going on in India. It's very tough situation, and I hope you all keep safe. And I look forward to speaking with all of you again. So on behalf of the Brussels School of Governance, thank you very much. And we look forward to having you again. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Gauri.
Thank you very much. Great discussion.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, Gauri. Thank you.
Hi. So Jess. Hello, Jess. Jess.